Imagine opening your eyes to a cold grey morning where the mist hangs heavy over wooden rooftops, and the faint sound of a church bell rolls through the air like a slow heartbeat, echoing against the stillness of a small New England village. The year is 1692, and though the snow has quieted the roads and the smoke curls gently from every chimney, there is something uneasy in the air, something that hums beneath every whisper, every prayer, every watchful glance from behind frosted glass. This is not just any town. This is Salem, a place where a single rumor could end your life, where the wrong word could summon a noose, and where people no longer feared death half as much as they feared the devil walking among them. To understand Salem is to understand a world shaped by fear disguised as faith. The Puritans who built this settlement on the edge of the wilderness believed they were God's chosen few, a small shining colony surrounded by darkness and temptation. They lived by the book, quite literally. Every rule, every word, every sermon woven into the rhythm of their days, until the line between devotion and obsession blurred beyond recognition. They prayed not just for salvation but for control, for safety in a world that seemed forever on the verge of chaos. And yet, beneath their solemn hymns and tight smiles, they lived with a constant trembling that evil could bloom in any heart, even the hearts of those they loved. All it would take was one strange sound in the woods, one unexplained illness, one child who spoke in her sleep, and the invisible war between God and the devil would be waged all over again, right there in their own kitchen. Salem, in truth, was never a story about witches. It was a story about people terrified of themselves. It began, as so many dark things do, with the smallest of incidents. Two young girls, Betty Paris, aged 9, and her cousin Abigail Williams, 12, fell into violent fits one bleak January morning. Their bodies shook uncontrollably, their eyes rolled back into their heads, and their voices twisted into screams that seemed to claw at the walls of their father's home. They cried out for mercy, for release, for something unseen that would not let them go. At first, the villagers blamed the winter air, or bad bread, or childish play, but when no cure came, when herbs failed and prayers changed nothing, the whispers began. Dr. Griggs, the town physician, examined them and could find no natural cause. So he said the words everyone had been afraid to speak aloud: "This is the work of witchcraft." And with that single phrase, the air in Salem changed forever. Fear spread faster than frost on a window pane. Mothers clutched their children closer. Men eyed their neighbors with suspicion. Women who had once shared bread at the same table now crossed the street to avoid one another. The invisible line between good and evil became a living thing crawling through every house and heart, dividing friend from friend, husband from wife. The Puritans believed the devil walked where faith faltered, and now in their minds he walked among them. Each cough, each unexplained shiver, each shadow in the firelight became proof of something sinister. And so, by the end of that bitter winter, Salem was no longer a village. It was a stage set for hysteria, ready for the curtain to rise. In the days that followed, the strange fits of the girls did not subside. Instead, they grew worse. Screams that split the quiet of the night, bodies that twisted in impossible ways, hands clawing at the empty air, as if fighting something no one else could see. The townspeople began to gather outside the Paris home, drawn by the sounds of torment and the scent of fear that hung over that little wooden parsonage like smoke after a fire. Reverend Samuel Paris, their father and minister, paced the floorboards with sleepless eyes, convinced that his own household had become the devil's playground. When remedies failed, when fasting brought no peace, and when the girls began to name shapes and faces that no one else could see, the whispers turned into names, real names. The afflicted children claimed that they were being tormented by the spectres of 3 women. Tituba, Reverend Paris's enslaved servant from Barbados; Sarah Good, a poor beggar woman who muttered to herself in the streets; and Sarah Osborne, a widow who rarely attended church and was known to quarrel over her husband's land. In Salem, those 3 details alone were enough to damn a soul. The accusations spread like fire on dry leaves. People who had lived their entire lives side by side suddenly began to doubt everything they thought they knew. It wasn't just the poor or the outsiders who were afraid anyone could be next. The minister's sermons grew darker, warning that Satan's army had infiltrated the colony, that he worked through human hands and human hearts. The villagers began to search for proof, but proof was a dangerous word in Salem, for what counted as evidence was not the truth, but fear itself. On a cold February morning, the three women were dragged before a gathering of ministers and magistrates, their wrists bound with rope, their faces lit by flickering candlelight. They were asked to confess to crimes that no one could see but everyone believed. Sarah Good denied it. Sarah Osborne denied it. But Tituba, trembling before the crowd, did something none of them expected. She confessed. She told them that the devil had visited her, that he appeared as a great black dog, a tall man in a dark coat, a bird perched on his shoulder, and that he had forced her to sign his book. The room fell silent. And then she said there were others. She could not say who they were, only that she had seen their faces in the shadows, that they too had signed their names in the devil's book. "It could be anyone," she whispered. "Anyone. The baker, the midwife, the man who built your fence, the woman who prays beside you every Sunday." In a single breath, Tituba unleashed something that could never be contained again: paranoia. By the time the snow melted and the roads turned to mud, dozens more had been accused. Some were taken in the night, torn from their homes before the eyes of their terrified children. Others turned themselves in, believing that confession was the only way to save their souls. But Salem had no mercy to give. The accused were shackled and locked in freezing jails, their names written into ledgers that would stain the town's history forever. And so began the Salem Witch Trials, a season of madness in which reason drowned beneath superstition, and every human flaw became evidence of the infernal. Cows dying in the field were blamed on curses. Children falling ill were said to be hexed. If your bread rose too high, or not at all, it was a sign. If your crops failed, a sign. If you spoke out, if you doubted the accusers, if you so much as looked at someone the wrong way, there it was again, another sign. The courts filled with people who had no understanding of what they were witnessing. Only the heavy certainty that evil was close enough to touch. Spectral evidence, visions, dreams, unseen forces became as binding as the written word. If a young girl claimed to see your spirit choking her in the night, then your fate was sealed. You could swear innocence until your tongue cracked and bled, but innocence was a luxury Salem had long forgotten. By spring, the town was no longer a place of worship, but a stage for hysteria. The meeting house, once filled with hymns, now echoed with the sobs of the accused. Wooden benches creaked beneath the weight of neighbors who would soon condemn one another. Men of faith sat at tables covered in quills and parchment, signing death warrants between prayers. Outside, the gallows stood against the sky like a warning carved from wood and rope. Those who survived the first round of trials spoke of the unbearable silence that followed each execution, the way the crowd would disperse in uneasy quiet, the way no one spoke of what they had seen, as if the very act of remembering might summon the devil himself, but silence could not save them. For once the town had tasted fear, it hungered for more. Soon, even the most respected names in Salem would find themselves accused. The minister's wife, the governor's sister-in-law, the very people who had condemned others now trembling beneath the same verdicts they once spoke. The difference between sinner and saint had dissolved entirely, leaving only the desperate need to survive another day. And perhaps that is the cruelest truth of all. That in Salem, survival had nothing to do with faith or goodness or reason. It depended only on who feared you more than they pitied you. By the early summer of 1692, Salem had lost its reflection. What had once been a modest Puritan village, governed by prayer and plainness, had transformed into a world where suspicion ruled more fiercely than law itself. The courts were overflowing. The prisons, damp and rotting, were filled with women, men, and even children, all accused of the same impossible sin, serving the devil. The line between justice and vengeance had blurred to the point of invisibility, and the sound of chains dragging across stone had become as ordinary as the ringing of the church bell. The first to face the gallows was Bridget Bishop, a woman whose reputation had always danced on the edge of scandal. She wore bright clothes, spoke her mind too freely, and ran an alehouse where laughter was a bit too loud for Puritan taste. To the judges, it was proof enough. When her trial began in June, the courtroom was heavy with heat and the smell of sweat and tallow candles. Young girls fell to the floor in spasms the moment she entered, claiming her spirit pinched and choked them before their very eyes. Bridget denied it all, but the air was thick with hysteria, and logic no longer had a voice. She was found guilty, led through the crowd beneath a cloudless sky, and hanged from a wooden beam as the villagers watched in uneasy silence. Her body swung gently in the summer wind, a warning and a promise that this was only the beginning. After Bridget's death, the machinery of accusation turned faster, grinding through lives with mechanical precision. More women were called before the court. Martha Corey, who dared to say that the trials were foolish. Rebecca Nurse, a grandmother of 71, frail and devout, beloved by nearly everyone until the moment she was named. The irony was unbearable. The more righteous a person appeared, the more likely people were to believe they had struck a deal with hell itself. The trials became a kind of theatre, morbid and mesmerizing. The afflicted girls sat together in rows, shrieking and mimicking the gestures of the accused, their bodies convulsing in rhythm with every plea of innocence. The judges leaned forward with their pens ready, recording these performances as divine proof. Each scream was a testimony, each fainting spell a piece of evidence. The accused could only stand and watch, as their lives were rewritten in front of them by frightened children and trembling magistrates. The church bells rang more often that summer, not for weddings nor for births, but for hangings. Between June and September, 19 people were executed, their bodies left dangling in the open air on a rocky hill that came to be known as Gallows Hill. The villagers said prayers, but they also averted their eyes. It was easier to pretend that justice had been done than to admit that the devil had won without lifting a finger. And then there was Giles Corey, 71 years old, husband to the late Martha Corey, whose faith in reason had already cost her her life. When Giles himself was accused, he refused to enter a plea. He knew the rules too well. If he pled guilty, he would hang. If he pled not guilty, and was found guilty anyway, which was certain, his land would be seized, and his sons left destitute. So he said nothing. Silence was his rebellion, and Salem could not bear silence. They took him to a field beside the jail, stripped him to the waist, and laid him on the cold ground. A heavy wooden board was placed upon his chest, and stone by stone they began to weigh him down. His ribs cracked, his breath came in shallow bursts. The earth beneath him darkened with rain. Each time they asked for a confession, he gave the same two words, more weight. For 3 days he endured until, with the rising of the sun, he no longer spoke at all. They buried him in an unmarked grave, his silence louder than any sermon ever preached in Salem. By the time the leaves began to turn, the town had devoured itself. Neighbors refused to speak. Families hid behind shuttered windows. Even the ministers began to doubt what they had unleashed. There were so many confessions now, so many stories of midnight pacts and spectral visits, that no one could tell truth from madness. People confessed not because they were guilty, but because they were tired of fear, tired of hunger, tired of seeing their friends vanish into the darkness, never to return. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the hysteria began to fade. The same voices that had once cried for punishment began to whisper that something had gone terribly wrong. A few ministers spoke of mercy, others of shame. Governor Phipps dissolved the court that autumn, uneasy with the rumors that his own wife might be next on the list. The trials came to an end, not with justice, but with exhaustion. Salem had burned through its terror, leaving behind nothing but ashes and regret. But the damage was permanent. The dead could not be unburied. The confessions, signed in trembling hands, could not be erased. And in the years that followed, those who had survived carried a quiet, unbearable weight, the knowledge that they had watched their friends hang for crimes no one could see, and had done nothing to stop it. Perhaps that is the true curse of Salem, not witches or demons, but the fragile, terrible power of belief itself. For in every age, and in every heart, there remains that same small fear that maybe evil is not something we can see at all, but something we create when we stop questioning the darkness. When the executions finally stopped and the nooses were taken down, Salem did not return to peace. The fields still grew barren, the river still froze in winter, and the air still seemed to hum with something uneasy, something that clung to the bones of the town like smoke that would not lift. The gallows on the hill were torn down, but their shape remained in memory, etched into every path that led toward the meeting house, every whispered prayer uttered in guilt rather than in faith. Those who had accused and those who had stayed silent found themselves bound by the same invisible punishment, remorse. The girls who had screamed in court grew into quiet women, burdened by the memory of faces they had condemned. The judges retired to their farms, their wealth intact, but their sleep broken by the same recurring dream, a rope creaking in the wind. Even Reverend Parris, whose sermons had once thundered about the devil's presence in Salem, found his congregation thinning. His words met not with devotion but with doubt. He eventually left the town in disgrace, muttering that God himself had turned his face away. Years passed and time did what it always does. It softened the details but deepened the wound. Families of the dead waited for apologies that never came, for justice that history could not offer. Some received modest reparations. Others faded into obscurity, their names surviving only in the court transcripts and in the cold arithmetic of history. 19 hanged, 1 pressed, 5 who died in jail. But numbers mean nothing to those who lived through it. The true cost of Salem was measured not in bodies but in trust, trust that was broken and would never fully return. And yet, in a strange and human way, the people of Salem began to build again. Children were born, crops were sown, laughter returned in hesitant waves, but something in the air had changed forever. They no longer looked at storms or sickness or bad fortune in the same way. They had glimpsed what fear could do when it dressed itself in the language of holiness. Even centuries later, when visitors walk the quiet streets of modern Salem, they sometimes say that the place still feels heavy, that the air seems older than the buildings, that there's a kind of silence that doesn't belong to any ordinary town. It's not the ghosts of witches that haunt this place. It's the echo of belief turned blind, of conviction without mercy, of human beings convincing themselves that evil always lives in someone else. And perhaps that's why you wouldn't survive Salem, not because you'd be accused, not because you'd hang, but because in a world ruled by fear and certainty, to doubt is the most dangerous thing of all. You would not survive because you would ask questions. You would not survive because you would think. And in 1692, thinking was the truest form of witchcraft there was. The years after the trials were strange ones, as if the village itself had aged a century in the span of a single season. People still prayed, still gathered each Sunday under the wooden rafters of the meeting house, but their voices were quieter now, cautious, subdued. There was no longer that feverish certainty in their words, no burning conviction that they alone were righteous. It was as though Salem had learned, in the hardest way possible, that faith without humility could destroy the very thing it tried to protect. Children born after the trials would grow up, hearing the stories whispered like cautionary psalms, how neighbors had turned on one another, how mothers had betrayed daughters, and how entire families had been ruined by the trembling finger of accusation. They would look upon the adults who had survived and see a weariness that had no name, a kind of shadow that lingered behind every smile, as if the whole town lived under a spell that could never be broken. The ministers spoke less of witches now and more of forgiveness, though few were brave enough to speak of guilt. The new sermons were softer, heavy with silence between each word, and when the congregation bowed their heads, each person was praying for something different, some for mercy, some for forgetfulness, and others simply for sleep. Outside, the forests pressed close to the edges of the village, vast and dark and unbroken. The Puritans had always feared those woods. They believed the devil lived there, whispering through the branches, but now they feared something else, themselves. The wilderness had always been a mystery. Now it was their own hearts that frightened them most. As decades passed, Salem's story spread beyond its borders. Other towns whispered about it. Scholars wrote pamphlets and sermons warning of the folly of the devil's snare, and travelers passing through would lower their voices when the name was mentioned. The people of Salem wanted to forget, but history had already decided that it would remember for them. Sometimes at night, the older villagers claimed they could still hear the echoes, the wooden creak of the gallows, the faint rustle of chains, the low murmurs of prayer mixing with the wind. Others said that the ghosts of the condemned did not haunt the living out of vengeance, but out of pity, for who could envy those who had survived, condemned to live with the memory of what they had done. And so the years turned, the seasons came and went, and Salem endured. Fields grew again. Children played where once the accused had walked to their deaths, and new houses rose from old foundations. But beneath the soil lay the bones of those forgotten, the true witnesses of what fear could do when it was allowed to dress itself in the garments of faith. It is said that even long after the trials, when lightning struck the hill where the gallows once stood, the villagers took it as a sign, a final judgment from heaven, or perhaps a reminder that no one had ever truly been innocent. They would gather there sometimes, quietly standing among the stones and weeds, saying nothing, each lost in private thought. There were no more sermons, no more confessions, only the whisper of the wind and the knowledge that history, like the forest beyond their fences, could never be fully tamed. In the decades that followed, the shadow of Salem stretched far beyond the borders of Massachusetts Bay, creeping quietly into the conscience of a young nation still trying to define what it meant to be civilized. The Puritan colonies began to fracture under the weight of their own contradictions. People who had once crossed an ocean for religious freedom had built a world where thought itself could be punished, and it was only a matter of time before the survivors began to ask why. Scholars, ministers, and judges who had taken part in the trials started to write letters of apology, some genuine, others desperate attempts to soothe the stain upon their names. One of the chief magistrates, Samuel Sewall, stood in his church and confessed his guilt publicly, asking that the innocent blood be pardoned. But confession, like prayer, could not rewrite what had already been done. The earth had already taken its due. As the colonies grew and as the Enlightenment crossed the Atlantic with its new and dangerous ideas, the story of Salem became a kind of parable, a warning that even the most pious community could fall into madness when it confused fear for virtue. People began to speak less of witches and more of human nature. The theologians still debated the devil's power, but the philosophers were beginning to whisper something new, that the real danger was not from demons unseen, but from the ones that lived in ordinary men and women, wearing familiar faces and speaking righteous words. By the time a century had passed, Salem had become a legend told in schools and sermons, an American myth steeped in cold mornings and judgmental eyes. The gallows had long rotted away, but the story survived, told and retold by those who needed to remind themselves that civilization is only a thin layer of order stretched over chaos, and that beneath it the old fear still stirs. Visitors came from distant towns to see where it had happened. They walked the same crooked lanes, touched the stones of the old foundations, and tried to imagine a world where a child's cry could decide a woman's fate. They would look around at the tidy streets and quiet harbour and wonder how such horror could have taken root in such a small, peaceful place. But Salem was never about a place. It was about people, and the stories people tell themselves to stay safe. Even now, centuries later, When the name Salem is spoken, it carries a weight that no time can erase. It is the sound of human fear made permanent, of belief turned weapon, of justice twisted by panic. The old meeting house is gone, the graves are weathered and uneven, but the lesson remains, lingering like the smell of smoke long after the fire has gone out, that when fear governs faith, truth becomes the first casualty. And though the world has changed, though the languages and laws are new, the spirit of Salem still flickers at the edges of every society that would rather punish doubt than confront its own reflection. The witch hunt has changed its shape, but not its purpose. It still lives in every age where people point their fingers before they open their eyes. And so the story drifts forward through the centuries until the cobbled streets and candlelit windows of 17th century Salem dissolve into the glare of electric light and the hum of the modern world. The names have changed, the language has softened, the gallows forgotten, but the rhythm of fear, the slow tightening of the throat when the crowd begins to murmur, remains the same. Today we watch screens instead of trials, but the spectacle feels familiar. Faces judged in pixels, words torn from context, guilt decided by consensus long before the truth arrives. The costumes are new, yet the ritual has hardly changed. People still search for witches, though now they are called by other names. Heretics, traitors, liars, threats. We gather in comment sections instead of meeting houses. We build pyres from rumours instead of wood, and our flames burn just as bright. The same hunger for purity, the same unease with ambiguity still hides in us. It only waits for the right spark. If Salem teaches anything, it is that hysteria never truly dies. It only sleeps, waiting beneath the surface of every society that believes itself safe from madness. The instruments of torture have become invisible. Shame, exile, silence. The courtroom is everywhere, and the judges are us. And yet, somewhere in the quiet spaces between all that noise, there are still those who remember. They read the old records, see the scrawled signatures of frightened hands, and feel the weight of those two small words that ended Giles Corey's life. More weight, they understand that the heaviest stones were never the ones on his chest, but the ones his neighbours carried in their hearts. If you walk through Salem now, you will find souvenir shops and costumed tours, laughter echoing down the cobblestones where prayers once broke. But when the evening fog rises from the harbour and the last voices fade, the town exhales a different kind of silence, the kind that reminds you that everything human, even cruelty, was once done in the name of righteousness. The air grows colder then, and the sea wind carries whispers that sound almost like apology. So, as night settles and the lights dim, remember you would not have survived Salem, not because you lack courage, but because courage there meant doubt, and doubt meant death. The lesson, however, is not despair, it is vigilance, an invitation to question, to listen, to keep the fire of reason burning even when fear demands darkness. And perhaps as you fall asleep tonight, you'll hear in the distance the faint creak of rope and the low hum of prayers carried away by time, and you'll know that the ghosts of Salem do not haunt to frighten us. They linger to remind us how easily we can become them. And in that stillness, when even the wind seems to hesitate among the old timbers and gravestones, you begin to understand that Salem was never just a place on a map, but a condition of the human soul, a fever that can rise wherever fear and certainty share the same breath. It does not need witches to awaken, it needs only suspicion, and a crowd, and the silence of those who know better but choose not to speak. Centuries of progress have not erased that pattern. It lies beneath every moral panic, every crusade dressed in virtue, every moment when we decide that someone else's suffering is necessary to preserve our peace. We build new towns, new churches, new networks of light and glass, and still the old fire glows in the cracks between us. But the story of Salem also carries a quiet mercy, for if we can remember what was done there, truly remember without disguise or excuse, then perhaps we can recognize the first stirrings of that madness before it grows too loud to stop. Perhaps remembrance itself is the only spell strong enough to break the curse. So let the gallows sleep beneath their grass. Let the names of the dead be spoken softly, without horror, without denial. Let the lesson travel forward, as steady and fragile as the flame of a single candle carried through the dark. And as you close your eyes now, imagine the snow falling again over that little village by the sea, the houses dim, the voices gone, the night heavy with the weight of all it has witnessed. Somewhere beyond the frozen fields, a bell tolls once and then fades, and the sound stretches out until it is only wind. Salem rests at last, and so do we.
They called it Halloween, Hallowmas Eve, or simply the night when the dead walked home. But in the Middle Ages, Halloween wasn't about candy or costumes, it was about souls. Hungry souls, forgotten souls, and the thin, trembling line between the living and the dead. Picture a world without streetlights, without pumpkin lanterns, without laughter echoing from door to door. The medieval night was black, truly black. When the sun slipped behind the hills, only the flicker of a tallow candle or a hearth fire dared to fight the darkness. And on the last night of October, people whispered that the darkness itself came alive. In England, Ireland, France, and the far corners of Europe, villagers believed that this was the night when the gates of purgatory creaked open. The souls of the restless dead wandered the earth searching for prayers, warmth, or the crumbs of bread left on cottage doorsteps. Halloween was not a party, it was a vigil, a night to remember the dead and to fear them just enough to stay alive. The medieval mind was a quiet storm of faith and superstition. Half the world lived by candlelight, and the other half by fear. To a peasant in the 13th century, the world was not divided into life and death as we think of it today. Instead, it was one continuous trembling thread that ran through both heaven and hell, through farm and churchyard alike. Death was not distant. It was a neighbour, a presence that sat at the edge of every hearth. And as autumn deepened, that presence grew stronger. When the last of the harvest was brought in, when the nights began to stretch longer than the days, people whispered that the air itself had changed. The wind moaned differently. Dogs barked at nothing. Candles flickered even when the windows were shut. It was said that the veil between the living and the dead had thinned, so thin that a soul could drift through the cracks of a door, or hover above a cradle as a chill in the room. October 31st was no ordinary night. It was Halloween, the eve of All Hallows or All Saints' Day, a night sanctified by the church yet haunted by something much older. In Ireland and Scotland, people remembered Samhain, the ancient Celtic festival marking the death of summer and the rebirth of winter. It was not celebrated with joy, but with awe. To the Celts, Samhain was when the boundaries between worlds blurred. Livestock were driven close to the villages, fires were lit high on the hills, and offerings of milk, bread, or meat were left outside to appease wandering spirits. Over the centuries, as Christianity spread, the church wrapped this ancient fear in new robes. Instead of the spirits of ancestors, priests spoke of the souls in purgatory, those waiting to be purified before entering heaven. Instead of offerings of food, people were asked to give prayers. But in truth, the old and the new overlapped like candlelight over shadow. In small villages across Europe, the Eve of All Saints was a night both holy and haunted. Church bells rang in the distance, tolling for the departed. Families gathered inside, shutters drawn tight, whispering prayers for their dead. Bread was baked, small, round cakes called soul cakes, each marked with the sign of the cross. These were left on windowsills or given to travellers, a sweet charity offered in exchange for a promise that the recipient would pray for the souls of one's loved ones. And yet, beneath the prayers, there was a deeper trembling. Many believed that on this night the dead themselves walked, that they could knock at your door in disguise, wearing the faces of strangers, testing whether you would show kindness or cruelty. To refuse them bread, it was said, could invite misfortune. To mock them could invite sickness. So, people disguised themselves too. In the Scottish Highlands and parts of northern England, villagers wore crude masks made of animal skins and soot. They dressed as the wandering souls, believing that by imitating the dead, they might be spared from harm. Some carried hollowed-out turnips with candles inside. a flickering light to guide friendly spirits and frighten away the wicked ones. The night itself was heavy with superstition. Black cats were watched with suspicion. Owls were said to carry the souls of the damned. A sudden gust of wind meant an unseen visitor had passed by. In every churchyard, candles flickered among the graves, for people believed that the dead would rise for a brief walk beneath the moon before returning to their rest. And above all, there was the sound, the long, mournful tolling of the church bell. In many towns, it began at dusk and continued until midnight, one bell for each soul lost that year. The sound rolled over the dark hills and through the thatched villages, mingling with the howling wind, a reminder that no one was ever far from death, or from hope. But Halloween in the Middle Ages was not entirely sorrowful. For some, it was also a night of stories, of sitting by the fire recounting old tales of saints and sinners, of miracles and hauntings. It was a time to remember those who had gone before, to honour them with prayer and food, and to find comfort in the belief that the living and the dead could still share a quiet conversation through the flicker of a flame. The peasants believed that if you listened closely enough on Halloween night, you might hear the footsteps of the departed passing by your door. You were not to open it, nor to call out, only to whisper a prayer. God rest their souls and keep them from harm. For in the Middle Ages, Halloween was not about fear of monsters. It was about the memory of the dead, the mystery of salvation, and the fragile courage of those who lived every day with death as a companion. By the time dusk fell over a medieval village on All Hallows' Eve, the world seemed to hold its breath. The fields, newly stripped of their harvest, stretched bare and silent. The air smelled of smoke and cold earth. In the dim light of tallow candles, people hurried to finish their chores, for few dared to wander after dark. The night, they said, did not belong to the living. Women drew the shutters tight, wedging cloth in the cracks to keep the wind from whistling through. Men doused the hearth with ash, leaving only a faint ember glowing beneath the iron pot. The smallest children were told to keep their voices low because spirits, like thieves, listened for laughter. It was said that joy invited them in. And yet, outside, there was movement, shadows passing between the cottages, the faint crunch of boots on frost. These were the soulers, the wanderers of the Halloween night. Wrapped in cloaks and masks of rough cloth, they went from house to house, carrying little lanterns made of hollowed turnips or gourds, their faces blackened with soot. Some wore straw hats stuffed with feathers, others draped old animal skins over their shoulders, the smell of smoke clinging to them. The disguise was not for mischief. It was for protection. If the dead roamed free, then it was safer to look like one of them. Children followed in groups, singing softly through the cold. A soul, for a soul cake. Pray you, good mistress, a soul cake. 1 for Peter, 2 for Paul, and 3 for him who made us all. Each house that gave a cake would be blessed with prayers for the family's dead. Those who refused were said to hear tapping at their windows before dawn. A quiet reminder from souls unremembered. In many places, the poor and the orphaned were allowed to roam freely this night, for it was believed that showing charity to them pleased God and comforted the spirits of one's ancestors. And so, the streets filled with shuffling feet, the soft glow of candles in hollowed gourds, and the low hum of prayers carried through the smoke. But not everyone was brave enough to go outside. The elderly stayed close to the fire, crossing themselves whenever the wind moaned. They spoke in whispers of things that had once been seen. Pale women walking the lanes with empty baskets, headless riders crossing streams, spectral monks gliding through churchyards. They spoke, too, of the fetch, a ghostly double said to appear before someone's death. Dogs howled at nothing, and when that happened, people recited the Lord's Prayer backwards, believing it would send the spirit away. Others burned bundles of juniper or rowan wood, the smoke thick and bitter, thought to ward off evil. The church tried to hold order in this uneasy time. Priests urged people to gather inside the chapel instead of wandering the lanes, to pray for the souls in purgatory rather than consorting with spirits. And so, in many towns, the bells tolled deep into the night, calling the faithful to candle-lit vigils, the pews filled with villagers wrapped in wool cloaks, their breath turning to mist in the cold air, their heads bowed as the priest chanted in Latin. But even in those sacred walls the air felt heavy. Every candle's flame seemed to flicker as though something unseen had passed by. People whispered that some souls came to church to listen too, to kneel beside the living, invisible but near. And far from the villages, in the lonely woods and high moors, there were others who worked their own forms of protection. The wise women, the healers, the midwives, the herbalists, gathered their herbs and whispered charms by moonlight. They burned sage and wormwood, sprinkled salt on thresholds, and placed iron shears beneath the bed to ward off spirits that might steal a sleeping soul. To the church, these women were suspicious. Too close to the old ways, too skilled with remedies, too bold with words that blended prayer and magic. But to the villagers, they were the ones who knew how to keep a child from fevers, a cow from dying, a soul from wandering too far from home. And on Halloween night, many left gifts at their doors: bread, apples, candles, small offerings for protection through the long haunted dark. Black cats slunk through the alleys, their eyes shining like coins in the moonlight. Owls called from the church steeple, and every sound seemed louder than it should be. In some regions, people believed that witches could transform into animals that night: crows, hares, even wolves. So any creature that crossed your path after midnight was to be greeted politely, for you never knew who or what it might truly be. And when the final bell of midnight sounded, the world held still. It was said that, at that moment, the souls of the dead began their journey back. The thin veil thickened again, the wind grew calm, candles that had burned all night guttered out, the living exhaled as though they had been holding their breath for hours. But even then, no one dared speak loudly. For though the night of spirits was passing, no one was certain that the last of them had truly gone. Outside, the turnip lanterns still flickered faintly in the windows, little beacons in the mist, guiding the souls home, and perhaps reminding the living that one day they too would walk that same quiet road. When dawn finally came after the long night of All Hallows' Eve, the world seemed washed clean. The air was sharp, and the earth smelled of wet leaves and smoke. In every village the bells began to toll again, slow, measured, unending, calling the faithful to the church for All Saints' Day. The villagers came quietly one by one, wrapped in cloaks and shawls. Their faces were pale from lack of sleep, their eyes red from candlelight. The church stood cold and echoing, its stones damp with morning mist. Inside, the light was dim, filtered through narrow windows of coloured glass. Candles burned along the altar, each one a prayer for a life remembered. This was not a day of laughter or feasting. It was a day of remembrance, a day when the living and the dead drew close enough to almost touch. The priest began the Mass in Latin. Requiem aeternam dona eis, Domine. Grant them eternal rest, O Lord. The words rolled through the air like waves, soft and steady. The people answered in murmurs, their heads bowed low. Outside, the bell tower kept tolling, its deep voice carrying over the fields, over the quiet cottages, over the graves beyond the wall. Children placed flowers, often wilted marigolds or rosemary, on the graves of relatives. Some families laid out small loaves of bread or bowls of porridge on the stones, offerings meant for those who had not yet found peace. It was believed that the dead could visit their resting places for one last look before returning to the realm beyond. In the countryside, this day flowed naturally into the next, All Souls' Day, the true day of the dead. If All Saints was for the holy and the blessed, All Souls was for everyone else, the forgotten, the lost, the nameless. It was the great equalizer of heaven's waiting room. Villagers prayed not just for their family, but for all the souls still wandering in purgatory, those trapped between salvation and suffering. The church encouraged this devotion, for every prayer, every candle, every mass was thought to ease the burden of a soul's cleansing fire. And so, for 3 nights and 3 days, the land glowed faintly with light. Candles burned in every window. Fires smouldered at the edges of fields. In monasteries, monks sang long into the night, their chants rising and falling like the wind through bare trees. In peasant cottages, families gathered to tell stories of ancestors, of miracles, of warnings whispered by spirits in dreams, It was a strange, suspended time, the world caught between death and winter. The harvest was finished, the cold was coming, and life itself seemed to pause. Some villages held processions through the streets carrying crosses and banners painted with skulls and angels, symbols of mortality and salvation. Children walked barefoot, holding candles, the wax dripping down their fingers. The sound of bells never stopped, not even at night, because the church taught that every tolling helped free a soul from suffering. There was no fear now, only solemnity. The spirits had been fed, prayed for and remembered. The living had fulfilled their duty. In the stillness after the final vigil, a kind of peace descended, quiet, steady and profound. And yet, even as the church tried to sanctify the season, the old customs persisted. Farmers still burned bundles of straw at crossroads to keep wandering spirits from returning. Women still hung sprigs of yarrow or rosemary above the door to guard against mischief. And in the dim corners of cottages, people still whispered about omens, candles that burned blue, mirrors that fogged without breath, footsteps heard when no one was near. For all their faith, medieval people lived in a world where the unseen was never far away. Heaven and hell were not distant kingdoms. They pressed close, invisible but ever-present, woven into the rhythm of daily life. When the final candle was extinguished on All Souls' Night, it was said that the dead had at last been comforted. The veil thickened once more, sealing the worlds apart, until next year. The villagers slept deeply that night, soothed by the thought that their prayers had done some good, that their ancestors were resting in peace. And somewhere, in the wind that moved through the fields, they imagined they could still hear a voice whispering thanks. Centuries passed, empires fell, languages changed, kings were crowned and forgotten. But every autumn, when the air turned cold and the fields grew silent, the same whisper returned, an old memory carried by the wind. The peasants of the Middle Ages could not have imagined our modern world. Electric lights chasing away the dark, laughter spilling through the streets, children wrapped in plastic masks instead of rough burlap. And yet, beneath the costumes and candy, something ancient still stirs. The story of Halloween did not die. It simply changed its clothes. By the 15th and 16th centuries, the practice of souling, poor children and travellers going door to door asking for food in exchange for prayers, had spread across Europe. In England, it became known as Souling Day. In Ireland and Scotland, it merged with guising, where children disguised themselves as spirits, saints or devils, performing songs or little plays in exchange for coins or sweets. The old turnip lanterns remained, carved with faces meant to ward off evil, and they glowed faintly in windows and along village paths. They were not decorations, but protections, tiny flames against the unseen. As Europe changed, so did its beliefs. The Reformation dimmed the church's hold over daily life, and the fear of purgatory faded. But the love of autumn rituals, of firelight and remembrance, endured. People still gathered to tell ghost stories, to remember their dead, and to feel that peculiar thrill that comes when the veil seems thin again. When settlers crossed the Atlantic to the New World, they carried these traditions with them. The Irish, the Scots, the English, all brought fragments of medieval Halloween in their hearts. In the American countryside, those fragments began to grow again, grafting themselves onto new soil. Pumpkins replaced turnips, larger, easier to carve, glowing brighter in the dark. Bonfires became parties, prayers turned into games, and the ancient door-to-door ritual of souling evolved once more into what we now call trick or treat. It was no longer about freeing souls from purgatory, but about the same exchange of energy, giving, receiving, and remembering that the night belongs equally to shadow and light. By the late 19th century, Halloween had become a night of celebration rather than fear. Children paraded in masks, lanterns swung from porches, and storytellers gathered in parlours to read tales of ghosts and old country legends. And though few spoke of saints or purgatory anymore, the essence of the medieval feast, the awareness of mortality, the honouring of the dead, the thinness of the veil, still lingered beneath the laughter. Even now, when we light a candle inside a carved pumpkin, we echo something that peasants did 1,000 years ago. We make light against the dark. We remember the souls who walked before us, and we keep them company for one night each year. For all its sugar and laughter, Halloween remains a gentle ritual of remembrance. A night when the past brushes softly against the present, when the world feels older than we can explain, and when, for a brief moment, we understand what the medieval world knew by heart, that life and death are not opposites but neighbours, and that between them lies only the flicker of a flame. And so the bells have stopped, the candles have burned low, and the souls have gone home. But somewhere in the night, the old prayers still echo, soft as breath, and eternal as the turning of the seasons. When the last candle was snuffed, the village sank once more into silence. The festival had passed, the bells had stopped, and the scent of tallow still lingered in the cold air. A faint ribbon of smoke drifted from the chimneys, rising into a pale grey dawn. The world felt thinner, as though something sacred had just brushed through it and gone. For the medieval soul, this was the most mysterious time of all, not the celebration itself, but the quiet after. In that hush, people said the dead listened one last time before returning to their long sleep. The fields stood bare and stiff with frost. Crows gathered on the fence posts, black against a sky the colour of iron. The earth was waiting for winter now, waiting for its own kind of death. And in that stillness, everyone could feel how close life and death truly were. In the villages of England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, the people went about their day in reverent silence. Women tidied the remains of the soul cakes, sweeping crumbs into the fire so that no restless spirit might be tempted to linger. Men mended fences and stacked wood for the long, cold months ahead. The sound of chopping echoed through the fields like the tolling of a slow bell. Children were told not to stray far from home for the next 3 days, for the spirits were said to linger in the hedgerows and riverbanks. Old women murmured that on certain evenings a candle should still be lit by the window, in case a lost soul had missed its path back to heaven. The church, ever watchful, allowed these customs to continue, so long as they remained wrapped in prayer. After all, every soul remembered meant one less wandering in the dark. Inside the chapels, the scent of incense mixed with cold stone, the wax from hundreds of candles pooled across the altars, catching the morning light in tiny mirrors of gold. The priest, weary from nights of vigil, whispered one last benediction, Requiem Aeternam. And as his voice faded, so did the boundary between prayer and silence. It was said that on the morning after All Souls' Day, if you walked alone through the village, you might hear faint footsteps that were not your own, soft, steady, and fading with each hour. Those were the souls, people said, retreating to their rest. Some swore they saw faces in the mist, a father long gone, a child lost to fever, a friend fallen in battle. Others claimed they felt only warmth, a brief, comforting touch, like a hand laid on the shoulder. For the medieval believer, these moments were not frightening. They were reminders to live rightly, to pray, to remember. As winter drew near, the people carried the memory of Halloween and the holy days that followed like a small ember of faith. They would speak of it by the hearth, of the candles that guided souls, of the masks that kept the living safe, of the whispered prayers that might shorten a spirit's suffering. And as snow began to fall over thatched roofs and silent churchyards, there was a sense that all of life was simply waiting for spring, for resurrection, for grace. They had lived through another turning of the year. The dead had been fed, the living had been reminded, and time had folded neatly back into its eternal rhythm. Halloween would come again next year, as it always had, in a world where every breath was still half prayer, half fear, and entirely human. In the medieval world, death was not an end, but a presence. It sat quietly at every meal, knelt beside every bed, walked the same fields as the living. Children played in churchyards where their grandparents were buried. Travellers slept in abbeys built atop the ruins of older pagan temples. Life and death were not separate lands. They were two sides of the same worn coin, passed from one generation to the next. Halloween and its companion feasts were not strange interruptions to this life. They were its truest reflection. They reminded the living that the veil was thin not just on one night of the year, but always. They taught that a prayer said for the dead was also a prayer for oneself, for one's children, for the village. Medieval people saw the world as layered like an onion. Heaven above, earth in the middle, purgatory below, hell deeper still. But on certain nights, those layers touched. All Hallows Eve was one such night. That was why bells rang so long, why candles burned so late, why cakes were baked and shared, why children sang at doors. It was not superstition alone, it was survival of the soul. And as the centuries rolled forward, these customs, these instincts, did not vanish. They seeped into everything, into winter fairs, into parish feasts, into quiet evenings by the hearth. They became the stories that parents whispered to their children, stories of saints who appeared as beggars, of angels who visited shepherds, of spirits who returned for a blessing before moving on. The medieval soul believed in a world brimming with signs. A flickering candle meant a soul had passed. A sudden gust of wind meant someone unseen was near. A dream on Halloween night could be a warning or a promise. People spoke of thin places, crossroads, thresholds, old wells, the edge of forests, places where the two worlds brushed together. On All Hallows Eve, the whole earth felt like a thin place, yet there was also comfort in this closeness. You were not truly alone in your grief. You were surrounded by a great company of saints, angels, and ancestors, an invisible village of the dead, walking beside the visible one of the living. This was not horror. It was belonging. It was continuity. When we look at our modern Halloween, children laughing under streetlights, pumpkins glowing bright orange, we are looking at the faint afterimage of that medieval belief. We are still walking the same path, though now it is paved, and we carry plastic buckets instead of lanterns. Even the smallest details echo the past. The masks our children wear are the descendants of the soot-blackened guises of Scottish villagers. The trick or treat rhyme is the echo of a souling song. The jack-o'-lantern is the turnip lantern reborn, bigger and brighter. To light a pumpkin on your doorstep is, in a way, to join 1,000 years of flickering lights guiding the dead. To hand out candy is, in a way, to continue the charity of soul cakes. To tell a ghost story is, in a way, to repeat the fireside whispers of a peasant family huddled against the cold. And in that moment, the medieval world rises up around you, dim, candlelit, full of prayers and shadows and quiet hope. By the time November settled over a medieval village, the festivals were over. The harvest stored, the animals penned, the shutters barred against the coming frost. Yet the memory of Halloween lingered like smoke in the rafters. In the evenings, families sat by the hearth, the flames burned low. Outside, frost silvered the thatch and turned the fields to glass. In that silence, old tales were told again. A grandfather would speak of the night he saw a white dog walk the lane and vanish. A mother would murmur of a candle that would not go out, no matter how she tried. A child would listen wide-eyed, clutching a piece of bread as though it were a charm. These were not stories of terror, but of connection. Signs that the world was larger than the eye could see. In a time when life was short and death certain, it was comforting to believe that no soul vanished completely, that even in the dark someone watched, someone remembered. The church calendar moved on, to Advent, to Christmas, but the memory of All Hallows clung to the corners of daily life. It coloured the way people dreamed, the way they prayed, the way they marked their dead. A handful of earth from a grave kept in a pouch, a candle lit at dusk without reason, a loaf of bread left on a windowsill. In this way, Halloween was not one night but a season, a slow fading of light, a slow turning inward, a slow reminder that every ending is also a beginning. And perhaps that is why, even now, the season of Halloween feels different from all others. The air smells sharper, shadows seem thicker, candles seem warmer. We may not ring church bells for the dead anymore, but we still light up the night, we still gather, we still remember. If you could step back into a medieval village on Halloween night, if you could stand in the damp chill, smell the smoke, hear the bells toll, you would recognize more than you expect. You would see children disguised, singing for soul cakes. You would see flickering lanterns, rough masks, offerings on doorsteps. You would feel the same hush that falls when the dark seems full of unseen company. And you would realize We are not so different. We still crave light in the dark. We still whisper to the past. We still hope that someone somewhere whispers back. That is what Halloween truly was in the Middle Ages. Not a carnival, not a horror story, but a conversation, a long, slow, flickering conversation between the living and the dead, held once a year in the heart of autumn, when the world felt oldest and the night most alive. And so, when you next see a child's jack-o'-lantern glow on a modern street, know that it carries the memory of 10 centuries of faith, fear, and flickering hope. Know that, for a moment, you are standing in the same thin place as a medieval villager 1,000 years ago, keeping the same vigil, lighting the same flame. The story of Halloween in the Middle Ages is not a tale of ghosts and witches alone. It is a memory of how people once spoke to the dark, not in screams, but in prayers. For the medieval world, night was not an enemy, it was a threshold. It held the unknown, yes, but also the sacred. Every flicker of a candle was both fear and faith, a trembling light in a sea of mystery. If you stood on a medieval hill on the last night of October, you would see small fires burning across the land, distant trembling stars scattered across the earth. You would hear the faint bells of chapels carried on the wind. You would see families walking home from church, holding candles to keep the cold at bay. Somewhere in that dark, a farmer would whisper the names of his parents before bed. A mother would hush her child with the sign of the cross. A monk, far away in a stone abbey, would light a candle for a soul he never knew, and across the fields the smoke of bonfires would rise like the breath of the world itself, a prayer too large for words. The medieval night was heavy with silence, but it was not empty. It was full of presence, of things felt but unseen. The air itself seemed to hum with memory, with longing, with the slow heartbeat of time. Even now, if you listen closely on Halloween night, when the streets grow quiet and the last candle flickers, you might sense it too. That old pulse, that soft reminder that the world has not forgotten, that the boundary between then and now, between life and death, between the medieval soul and the modern one, is thinner than we think. We do not ring bells for the dead anymore, but we still feel the pull of that same ancient rhythm. We still light candles in windows, we still share food, we still tell stories to keep the dark gentle. And somewhere in all of this, the ghosts of the Middle Ages walk quietly beside us, unseen but at peace. Because to remember is to resurrect, to speak of them, the villagers, the monks, the mothers, the children, all those who feared the dark but faced it anyway, is to let them breathe once more. Halloween, as it truly was, is not gone. It lingers, in the glow of the pumpkin, in the hush of the night, in the fragile courage of the living. It is the oldest promise humankind ever made that we will not forget, that even when the light fades, we will keep a flame burning for those who came before. And so, as the candles gutter out, as the last bell fades into the wind, the night closes gently around us, not in fear, but in reverence, not in horror, but in peace, for the veil may close again, but the memory never does. This was what Halloween was really like in the Middle Ages. The centuries rolled forward, slow and unhurried, like the turning of an enormous wheel beneath the heavens. The world changed its face, but never its soul. The great bonfires that once burned atop the hills, trembling in the black air of the medieval night, gave way to gentler lights, to lanterns glowing in the windows of towns, to candles flickering on brick porches, to the soft hum of electric bulbs that chase away the dark, but never quite erase it. The chants of monks that once rose in cold stone chapels became the laughter of children running through the streets, their masks bright and harmless, their voices echoing through neighbourhoods, where the air still carries the faint scent of smoke and sweetness. The sound has changed, the faces have changed, the purpose has shifted, and yet the longing beneath it all remains untouched. The same quiet rhythm, the same old pulse, the same ancient heartbeat that hums whenever autumn turns toward its end. Where once, in forgotten villages, the poor and the hungry went from door to door asking for soul cakes and offering prayers for the dead, now children in plastic costumes knock for candy, smiling beneath store-bought masks, their little hands outstretched in the same act of asking, of receiving, of ritual exchange. and where once turnips were carved into hollow lanterns to frighten away the spirits of the restless dead, now pumpkins glow larger and brighter, lined along city streets like embers from a fire that has never gone out. The words have changed, the gestures have softened, but the soul of it, the reason we light a flame in the dark, the reason we gather together when the wind grows cold, that remains as true as it ever was. We may no longer speak of purgatory, or of souls walking home through mist, but something deep within us still remembers the season's meaning. It stirs quietly each year when the first leaf falls, when the air turns sharp and smells faintly of wood smoke, when the daylight fades too early and the night grows long enough for memory to slip through. We may call it nostalgia or superstition or simple tradition, but what it truly is remembrance. The old remembrance of all who came before us, of all who once stood where we now stand, lighting their own small fires against the great unknowing. And so, every Halloween, without quite realizing it, we repeat the same gesture made by our ancestors 1,000 years ago. We light a candle, we share what we have, we look into the night and make peace with its silence. It is the same fragile defiance, the same quiet courage, to face the dark and say, I am still here, and I have not forgotten. Because Halloween in its truest form has never been about horror. It has always been about mercy, about generosity, about memory. It is the echo of those ancient vigils, those soft prayers whispered into the wind for the sake of the lost, those small acts of kindness that kept the living tethered to the dead, and the dead tethered to hope. And now, even as the world blazes with modern light, the echo endures. It hums in the laughter of children, in the glow of every jack-o'-lantern, in the quiet rustle of leaves against the pavement. It lingers in that strange moment, sometime around midnight, when the streets fall silent and the last candle flickers in the window. That faint, shimmering second when you can almost feel the breath of the old world brushing past your own. For in that moment, if you listen closely, you might hear the same bells that once tolled through medieval mist, might see, in the corner of your vision, the faint outline of a villager, watching from the edge of the modern street, not haunting, not lost, but simply remembering. And perhaps, if the light catches just right, you will see that you too are part of their story, one more keeper of the flame, one more soul in the long procession of those who refuse to let the dark go unanswered. Halloween has changed its face 1,000 times, but its heart has never changed. From sacred fires to city lights, from soul cakes to candy bars, from whispered prayers to songs and laughter, it has always been the same quiet promise between the living and the dead, that as long as we remember, no one is ever truly gone. So when the wind turns cold this year, and the candles tremble on your windowsill, pause for a moment before you blow them out. Feel the breath of autumn, the weight of time, the unseen crowd that stands beside you in the dark, and know that the same flame that burns in your hand tonight once burned in theirs. The centuries have passed, but the light remains, faint, trembling, eternal, carried through the dark by hands that never let go. There is a reason this night endures when so many other rituals have faded into dust. It endures because it speaks softly to something that never changes inside the human heart. That tremor of wonder that wakes when the world begins to die for the winter, and we remember that we too are mortal. We need Halloween because it teaches us how to look at death without running from it. In the Middle Ages, people walked hand in hand with loss. They buried children and parents within sight of their door, and still they lit their candles. They sang for the souls in purgatory, not to mock the dark, but to make peace with it. And in that act there was wisdom, the understanding that fear and love are not opposites but companions, that to grieve is to remember, and to remember is to love. We, the modern ones, have hidden death behind hospital walls and glowing screens. We have traded the slow tolling of bells for the hum of traffic, the silence of the graveyard for the noise of endless days. And yet, once a year, the old rhythm returns. The air cools, the leaves fall, and something ancient stirs beneath the surface of our bright world. We hang paper ghosts in our windows. We light our pumpkins, and though we laugh, Though we dress the ritual in plastic and colour, part of us still knows what we are doing. We are making peace again with the dark. Halloween is the last whisper of an older faith, the one that taught us that the world of the living and the dead are not strangers. It reminds us that remembrance is an act of courage, that to call a name aloud is to keep it alive, that to share light is to say, "I have not forgotten you." It reminds us that the veil is thin not only between this world and the next, but between who we were and who we are still becoming. We need Halloween because we have not yet learned how to live without mystery. For all our progress, for all our light, we still crave the slow comfort of ritual, the feeling that our stories reach beyond us, that someone, somewhere, might remember us when we are gone. And so each October we return quietly to the same place our ancestors stood, between fire and frost, between laughter and prayer, between the living and the dead. Look around on that night. Beneath the masks and the lights you will see the same fragile humanity that filled the medieval churches and village streets. You will see people longing to belong, longing to be forgiven, longing to believe that love outlasts the body. You will see in every candle the reflection of all who came before. And when the night is over, when the candles gutter out and the streets grow still, what remains is not fear, but gratitude. For the dark, which teaches us to see the light. For the dead who remind us how precious the living are. For the story that continues century after century, whispered through smoke and wind, that even the smallest flame can hold back the endless night. So keep your candle lit, wherever you are. Let its glow fall against the window, trembling and gold. Know that someone, long ago, did the same for you, and that someone long from now will do it again, because the heart of Halloween has never been about ghosts at all. It has always been about remembrance, about tenderness, about the fragile, beautiful fact that even in the dark we reach for one another. And as the centuries turn and the bells fall silent, and the fires become only sparks against the sky, that small, stubborn act, the lighting of a single flame, is enough to prove that the human spirit still endures. And now the night has grown very still. The stories have been told, the bells have fallen silent, and the last candle flickers in the breath of the wind. Outside, the air smells of cold earth and wood smoke, and the world feels vast again, ancient, eternal, and kind. Somewhere far away, the same moon that once looked down on monks and peasants now shines upon empty streets and glowing windows. Its light touches every time at once. The fields of the Middle Ages, the rooftops of our cities, the quiet rooms where someone whispers a name into the dark. Time folds in on itself like hands in prayer, and in that silence you can almost hear them. The faint murmur of forgotten hymns, the soft laughter of children collecting soul cakes, the heartbeat of 1,000 generations keeping watch together through the centuries. The candle burns lower, its flame trembles, bends, steadies again. It is small, and yet it is everything. It is the memory of all that was, the hope of all that will be, the proof that the night has never won. So close your eyes just for a moment and listen to the quiet. Feel the warmth of the flame even as the wind brushes past your cheek. Somewhere across the long bridge of time, someone once stood exactly where you stand now and whispered into the darkness, "Be not afraid." That whisper has never stopped travelling. It passes through every age, through every soul, through every light we keep alive, and it will go on long after we are gone. Carried by the wind, remembered by the flame, reborn each year when the leaves begin to fall. For Halloween, in the end, is not about death. It is about the stillness that follows life, the promise that memory is stronger than silence, and the simple act of lighting a candle. Not to banish the dark, but to share it gently. And as the flame fades, know this. The story is still being told, in every light that trembles, in every soul that remembers, in every heart that refuses to let the night have the last word. Sleep now, traveller. The dead are at rest. The living have kept their promise. The candles are gone, but the light remains. Gather round, brave souls, and listen closely. Tonight, we're embarking on a journey far, far away to a time of windswept lands and mighty longships, a time when fierce warriors called Vikings roamed the northern seas. We often picture them as strong, fearless, with hearts of iron, men of great battles and grand adventures. But what if I told you there's a secret about these Vikings? A quiet truth buried deep beneath the myths, a story about love, identity, and hidden desires in their world. A story whispered only in the shadows, far from the eyes of gods and kings. Before we begin our whispered tale, I'd love to know, where are you snuggled up and listening from tonight? Let us know in the comments below. Now, dim those lights. Prepare to uncover a chapter of Viking history that was almost erased, but not quite. The unspoken truths of a Viking day. Close your eyes, my brave listener. 1, 2, 3, and whoosh, you've opened your eyes in the middle of the ancient north. There's no soft pillow, no warm lamp, just the earthy scent of wood smoke, salted meat hanging from the rafters, and the rhythmic clanging of metal from a nearby forge. This is the Viking Age, a world of thick beards, warm furs, and, oddly enough, even thicker silence around certain subjects. In this world, glory in battle is everything. A single, clean axe throw can make a man a local legend. But not everything is carved in runestones. Some truths linger in the shadows, spoken only in quick glances, never in words. You've dropped into a culture where masculinity is almost a religion. While everyone raises horns of mead and shouts about conquests, somewhere behind the longhouse eyes might linger a moment too long, hands might brush on purpose, and shared sleeping furs could mean more than just keeping warm. So, here's a quiet question to ponder. If a Viking man felt something real for another man, something tender, something longing, would he still be seen as a fierce warrior? The Vikings didn't have a word for homosexuality like we do today. No rainbow banners, no boxes to tick on a census form. But that doesn't mean same-gender attraction didn't exist. It just means it existed without a label, often without a voice, like a wolf moving silently in the fog. You might sense it, but you'd never dare speak of it too loudly. Imagine taking a walk through a bustling coastal village in the 9th century. There's Skuld the shipbuilder, known for crafting longships that skim the sea like gulls. No one questions why he never marries. They just whisper about his strange closeness with Eric the blacksmith, with his burn-scarred hands and crooked grin. The two of them hunt together, eat together, drink together, and always sleep in the same hut. They're just friends, someone might say, and then let the sentence simply drift away into the air. This was the Viking way. Carve your war stories into rock, but let your softer truths disappear like breath in the cold winter air. Relationships that didn't fit the expected warrior mold were quietly sidestepped, leaving no official records, just rumours baked into silence. Oddly enough, at this same point in history, thousands of miles away in Japan, samurai could form intimate bonds with each other without scandal. But here in Scandinavia, the land of berserkers, gods, and long winters, the male identity was chained tightly to control, aggression, and the appearance of dominance. Does that remind you of anything, even today? In some places, men are still expected to be tough, quiet, emotionless. Crying, weakness, vulnerability, shameful, and back then the rules were even more brutal. If a Viking was seen as being lesser in control, in status, or even in bed, it could damage his honour permanently. You hear the story of Halldor, son of a local chieftain. He refused to marry 3 different women, in fact. People talked, his parents worried. Some said he was different, but no one could question his warrior status. He never lost a wrestling match, and was an expert with the bow. Once, villagers whispered he gave a silver ring to his close friend Bjorn during a strange, quiet ceremony by the river. But no one asked questions, and Halldor, like many others, slipped quietly into the forgotten margins of history. You're starting to notice the pattern, aren't you? In Viking culture, closeness between men could exist so long as it didn't announce itself. You could hug, you could sleep side by side, you could even call each other soul-bonded in private. Just don't cross the invisible line. And if you do, don't get caught. The irony is, the line wasn't even clear. It wasn't about love, it was about power. If you were the one being dominated, socially or sexually, you could be mocked, even outlawed. Not because of who you loved, but because of what role you played. Viking society feared shame far more than sin. Sound familiar? Even today, some people care less about who you love and more about how you present, as if being seen as soft, passive, or emotional is somehow a crime worse than theft. And then there's the unspoken rule. As long as nobody says it out loud, it didn't happen. Denial becomes protection. Silence becomes survival. Whispers in the sagas. You crouch beside the fire, thumbing through brittle sagas, those sprawling tales carved from storm and steel, heavy with blood feuds and gods who don't always behave. At first glance, they're all battle cries and bone-snapping glory, but if you listen carefully, really listen, you'll begin to notice what isn't said. The silences between the sword fights, the phrases that drift just shy of confession. You start seeing odd turns of phrase: a warrior held more love for his comrade than any wife, or two men who shared one heart, one hearth, one fate, and then silence. No comment, no judgment, just the next voyage or duel. It's as if the scribes left a space where your thoughts are meant to wander. These stories don't speak in declarations. They hint, they murmur, they let you drift near the edge of something tender, and then pull away. A man grieves another, not as a brother or a fellow fighter, but with a sorrow so intimate it nearly breaks the rhythm of the saga. And then, without pause, the tale gallops forward. There's a moment in Jarl's saga, a tale more layered than most, where the bond between two men, Jarl and Gunnar, stands out. Their affection, their loyalty, the sheer grief when one is gone. It's enough to make you stop and ask, was this just friendship born of shared bloodshed, or something deeper left unsaid? And the saga, as is their way, never confirms, but they certainly don't deny. But then the tone shifts when you reach the insults. Suddenly, the language sharpens. The most cutting thing a man could be called wasn't coward or traitor, but something closer to ergir, pronounced ergir, a word that brims with contempt. To be called ergir was to be smeared with the accusation of unmanliness, not for feeling love, but for being the one who was seen to yield. It wasn't about emotion, it was about power. A man accused of losing his masculine dominance, especially in any intimate context, was disgraced in the eyes of others, whether the accusation was true or not. Viking society had an unspoken balance. You could admire another man, even embrace him in battle or grief, but the line was drawn where control seemed to shift. The fear wasn't love, the fear was surrender. Still, you come across tales that refuse to be neatly categorized. There's the quiet story of Thorstein and Grim, side by side in war, never seen apart in peace. They built a life that required no wives, no heirs, just each other and a house at the edge of the woods. The saga says they were well satisfied in one another's company. That's all. No more, no less. And that silence, it echoes louder than any battle horn. You keep reading and find lines of poetry. Skaldic verses composed not for war but for men whose strength was seen in the way they looked at each other. Some poems speak of a warrior's hair like golden fields, of a voice that stirred something in the chest, not the sword arm. These aren't metaphors of competition, they're songs of longing. Take Egil Skallagrimsson, for instance, famous for splitting skulls as easily as he did stanzas. His verses hold strange flashes of tenderness when he describes fellow men, not in every line, not always clearly, but enough to raise your eyebrow and make you read it again, slower this time. And then there's Arnod, a lesser-known skald whose verses didn't make it into grand collections but survive on a single piece of carved pine found in the wreckage of an old farmstead. He wrote of a man who smelled of ash and pine and stood like a cliff in the wind. His name lost, his story vanished, but his emotion etched deep, weathered but intact. You glance back over the sagas you've read, some filled with fire and vengeance, others quieter, softer, and it's in those quiet ones where you find the most telling absences. No one condemns, no one celebrates. No one names what might have been love, but the feeling lingers, like breath on frost. You begin to realize the Viking world didn't erase queerness. It folded it into the folds of its stories, wrapped in wool, tucked between lines, hidden but never fully gone. The moral fog. You step into the fog of Viking morality now, a place full of half-spoken truths and tangled threads. There were no books of commandments carved in stone, no single scroll listing what was right or wrong. Instead, there were expectations, things you simply knew not to do, even if no one had said it aloud. And when it came to love, intimacy, or anything that made you look soft in the eyes of other men, silence wasn't just recommended, it was survival. Honor was the currency. Lose it, and you might as well vanish. But how you lost it, that's where things got complicated. A man who cried at a funeral, that could be forgiven. A man who loved another too openly, that could not. You hear again about Ægir, but now it takes a new shape, not just as insult, but as accusation. If a man was suspected of being Ægir, even without proof, he could be denied entry to trade gatherings, barred from settling land, or challenged in court. Not because he had harmed anyone, but because he had stepped outside the unwritten circle of masculine control. There's a tale from the inland valleys about two brothers, one strong and celebrated, the other quiet, more inclined to weaving than war. The village boys mocked the younger one behind his back, called him half-woman, whispered that he sewed more than he spoke. His brother, ashamed, refused to defend him. The younger brother eventually vanished into the forests, never seen again. No crime was recorded, no exile declared, and yet he disappeared. Not by punishment, but by pressure. And here lies the cruel brilliance of Viking moral codes. They didn't always need laws. They had expectation. You didn't have to be outlawed to be erased. You just had to be inconvenient. Even within families, affection was shown carefully. Fathers didn't kiss sons, brothers didn't say I love you. That kind of language belonged to women, or to the dead. So if two men found love in each other, how could they possibly name it? They didn't. They showed it in quiet ways, through loyalty, through shared homes, through the decision to never marry and never explain why. Some of those gestures became part of local memory. In one fishing village on the edge of the northern coast, two men named Aki and Thormod were said to have spent 40 winters in the same hut. They raised goats, told stories by candlelight, and died just a month apart. People called them inseparable friends, but someone, long after, carved a heart between their names on a grave marker deep in the moss. A simple shape, barely visible now. No one knows who carved it, no one ever dared remove it. You begin to see how intimacy found ways to exist without names. It slipped through cracks, lingered in gestures, buried itself in domestic routines that looked ordinary, but weren't. Like two warriors sharing one bowl, like one man sewing the other's cloak by firelight. The things no saga would waste ink on, but which carried entire lifetimes of meaning. Even religion didn't offer clarity. The Norse gods were complicated. They changed shape, changed gender, deceived and seduced. There was no clear moral hierarchy in their myths. But in real life, people were expected to play their part, to perform their gender, their role, their place. To step out of that role, even in joy or love, was to invite doubt. And in small communities, doubt was enough to destroy. You start to feel the weight of it, how exhausting it must have been to live within so many invisible fences, to know that a misstep wouldn't lead to a whip or a judge, but to the slow turning away of neighbours, the empty seat at the feast, the silence at the hearth. It wasn't law that cut deepest, it was isolation, and yet, for some, that risk was worth it. Because sometimes, story is all you have, and in Viking mythology, story is where the boundaries blur the most, especially when the gods themselves refuse to follow the rules mortals die trying to uphold. Gods who break the rules. You walk deeper into the mist of legend now, where thunder cracks like judgment and trickery is considered divine. Here stands Loki, the shape changer, the sly one, a god who does not ask permission to cross lines. He leaps over them, grinning. In a world where human men are bound by reputation and fear of shame, Loki moves freely, shedding skin, swapping roles, slipping between male and female as if the difference were as thin as smoke. You hear the tale again. Loki, in the form of a mare, seduces a powerful stallion to prevent a giant from finishing his work. It's a joke, almost, a bit of clever mischief. But then he conceives, carries the foal, and gives birth to Sleipnir, the 8-legged horse destined to carry Odin himself. No punishment, no shame, just a story retold with a laugh, as though a male god becoming a mother were a footnote, not a scandal. And you begin to understand. The gods weren't bound by the same codes as men. For mortals, stepping out of your assigned role invited insult, exile, or death. But for gods, crossing those same boundaries brought fame, even reverence. Loki breaks rules because he can, because in myth, disruption is necessary. Still, he is not without consequence. Loki is beloved and hated, needed and mistrusted. He makes the gods laugh, then makes them nervous. His gender bending and chaos weaving don't always feel rebellious. Sometimes they feel honest, as if Loki is showing the world what it fears in itself. Then there's Odin, the All-Father, a warrior, a king, a seeker of knowledge who, unlike any other male deity, openly practices Seder, the mysterious Norse magic associated with women. It's not soft magic, it's powerful, terrifying, able to alter fate. And yet, for mortal men, learning it was considered shameful. Only Odin could do it without ridicule, because only Odin stood so far above reproach that no one dared question his authority. So here you have it. Two of the most powerful gods in the Norse pantheon actively crossing gender expectations. Odin through magic, Loki through transformation, both operating outside the boundaries that human men were expected to guard with blood. You remember a fireside story about Audis, a vulva, a seeress who once lived on the coast. She trained with a man named Svanna. They say no one ever saw him wear men's clothes, and his voice was said to be gentler than the sea in spring. He would chant long into the night, foretelling storms and births alike. Some called him cursed. Audis called him teacher. After one winter, he vanished. No body, no goodbye, only a strand of beads left on her staff and a carved rune near the shoreline. A spiral within a spiral. Was Svanna real? No saga records him. But people remembered, and that's how the myths lived, braided into daily life, sometimes whispered as truth, sometimes used to explain what polite conversation avoided. If the gods could be fluid, could shift and change and love in strange shapes, perhaps there was room for humans to feel these things too, even if they couldn't say them. You wonder how many quiet boys listened to tales of Loki and felt a strange comfort, not from his mischief, but from his motion, his refusal to be one thing, his ability to be both, to create life and chaos in the same breath, to exist where rules are soft and nothing is fixed. That's the power of story. It holds what society can't. And for some, it was the only place they were ever allowed to exist at all. Bonds in the battlefield's edge. But on the edges of battlefields, under tents thick with sweat and smoke, something else was growing. Something not told in sagas or carved into stone. Bonds between men that weren't made of blood or oath, but of something quieter, something stronger. You step into the circle of warriors, men cloaked in iron and silence. They drink together, fight together, sleep side by side on cold ground, with only their breath and blades for warmth. These are not soft men. Their hands are hardened, their scars deadly. But among them, in the moments between violence, tenderness can bloom like moss in stone cracks, unnoticed by most, but rooted deep. There was a kind of love here that dared not name itself, the kind built over seasons of surviving beside one another, of tending wounds and sharing stolen bread. A love that grew not in stolen glances, but in the quiet fact of choosing to live another day, if only to see one face again. You hear stories passed down in the corners of longhouses, like the tale of Brander and Hallie, two warriors who never married, never parted, and were always chosen together for raids. No one asked why. No one needed to. They fought as one body, their timing so perfect it became legend. Some said their swords never clashed unless in practice with each other. When Hallie fell in battle, Brander refused to flee. He held the dying man in his arms and sang not a war song, but a lullaby his mother once sang to him beneath northern stars. Their chieftain, who had known them since youth, buried them side by side in a single grave. The stones round their mound bore no runes, but someone, no one knows who, later carved a ring between their names. No one ever removed it. These weren't isolated cases. There are more whispers if you know where to listen. Bonds that stretch past strategy and into something else entirely. But the line between friendship and something more was always hidden in fog, perhaps by design, perhaps for protection. It wasn't unusual for Viking warriors to share sleeping space, to travel in pairs, to spend years of their lives tied to the same man, more closely than to their families. But if that bond crossed into something deeper, into love, longing, even physical closeness, it had to remain unspoken, wrapped tightly in layers of duty, loyalty, or the ever-convenient label of brotherhood. It reminds you of how the world often tolerates what it refuses to see. If something is invisible, it doesn't challenge the order of things. If two men live together for decades but never say why, well then, no rules are broken, even though everyone knows and always did. But for those living it, there must have been moments, a lingering look after battle, a hand gripping a wrist too tightly, too long, the ache when the other was gone. These things live in the spaces between stories, because they were too risky to say aloud. You think of an imaginary man, though you're certain someone like him must have lived, a berserker who wore the skins of bears and feared nothing except losing Leif, his shield brother. They met in their 12th year, survived 4 winters of brutal campaigns, and once held off a dozen men by guarding each other's backs. No one dared mock them, not because people didn't wonder, but because no one wanted to face the rage of the berserker if they did. People didn't need confirmation, they needed myths to stay intact. And so long as the love stayed behind closed tent flaps, it could be ignored. But what is brotherhood truly, if not a space where vulnerability is allowed to breathe? Viking society praised loyalty and honour among men, yet feared what might happen if that loyalty became too tender, too visible. So these bonds, stronger than iron, were folded into the culture's blind spot. They were tolerated until they weren't, accepted until someone asked the wrong question, and then the silence would fall again, especially when the world of men began to blur with the world of magic, where boundaries softened and even more rules dissolved into mist. Magic and mystery, the Cider Men. You step into the dim, smoky tent of a cider worker, a practitioner of Norse sorcery. The air is thick with the scent of burning herbs, and strange symbols hang from the rafters. This is not a warrior's world. This is a place of visions, of chants that call winds, of knowledge that unsettles the proud. And here, it's no longer just about power through strength, it's about power through the unseen. Cider was magic of the deep kind, the kind that touched fate, unravelled secrets and foretold doom. And it was feared, not just because of what it could do, but because of who often wielded it. Women, mostly, but sometimes men. And when they did, society grew uneasy. To practice cider as a man was to walk a narrow ridge between reverence and ridicule. It required robes, rituals, and the adoption of traits that Viking society labelled as feminine. The practitioner might wear flowing garments, speak in altered tones, or step away from the behaviours expected of a warrior. And for many, that was enough to invite suspicion, or worse. You hear of men who risked everything to study it, like Stigar, a man from the northern forests remembered only in the stories of a coastal village. He was called Half-Man by some, and Stormcaller by others. His rituals brought safety to ships and healed sick children, yet he was never allowed to sit at the high table. He walked the village's edge, eyes downcast, always watched, never welcomed. But people still came to him at night, in secret. You sense it clearly now. Queerness and magic in Viking society were often treated the same way. Feared, needed, hidden. Not because either was evil, but because both slipped beyond control, and that frightened those who wanted everything neat and named. The word Sederman, a man who practices Seder, carried layers of tension. On one hand, it marked a man as someone with knowledge of the divine. On the other, it made him suspect. To step into this role was to risk being labelled Ergir, that same accusation we've heard before, tied not just to passivity, but to stepping outside masculine decorum. So a man could heal a dying child and still be mocked because he wore a blue robe while doing it. And yet for some, that calling was stronger than fear. There's an old tale passed down among farmers about Ari, a cedar man who lived alone at the edge of the wetlands. He was known to wear silver rings and speak to ravens. Most villagers avoided him in daylight, but they tell a quieter part of the story too, of his deep affection for a fisherman named Fong. The two were often seen exchanging fish for herbs, standing too close, speaking too softly. One winter, Fong drowned, and though no ritual was asked for, Ari stood waist-deep in the frozen fjord at dawn, chanting until his voice broke. That year, the herring returned in record numbers, they say. No one ever called him Ergir again. You realise something vital here. Those who walk the line between gender, between power and tenderness, between love and magic, weren't erased completely. They were remembered, not always kindly, but never forgotten, because in some small way people feared what they might lose if they disappeared. Seder made space for those who didn't fit, not just men who loved differently, but anyone who stepped outside the hard-edged codes of Viking behaviour. It offered a path, not safe, but possible. Still, it's hard to ignore the price. Isolation, mockery, the constant need to justify one's place, and the knowledge that even your usefulness didn't guarantee acceptance. So those who practiced cider, those who lived on love whispered rather than shouted, learned to survive by becoming myth themselves. Because if you became too strange to judge, you might become too sacred to touch. The Shield Maidens, women of war. And nowhere was that truer than among the women who chose to live outside the lines entirely. Women who fought, who hunted, who wore armour as easily as silence. Shield Maidens, they were called. But there's more to them than the stories allow. You walk with them now, through windswept hills and training fields, marked not by ploughs but by axes. They are not common. Not every village welcomed them. Not every saga recorded their names. But they appear, again and again, like flares in the dark. Women who refused to marry, refused to serve ale, and instead rode into battle with the fury of a winter storm. The most famous is Lagertha, her name echoing from the Gesta Danorum, where she slays men and leads armies with a calm more terrifying than rage. She was said to have been once married to Ragnar Lothbrok, but not before she had proven herself more than his equal in war. And even then, she left him, returned to rule on her own. That part conveniently gets glossed over in later tellings. You start to notice a pattern. Shield Maidens are often remembered but rarely explained. Why did they choose this path? Why didn't they marry? Why were they always so alone? Perhaps not so alone. There's a mention in one Icelandic folk tale of two women, Hervor and Astrid, who trained together from childhood, shared one sword between them, and were buried in the same mound with only one name etched into the stone: Valiant. Nothing more. Their story isn't found in royal chronicles. It was passed on by shepherds and weavers, as if to say, we remember, even if the scribes won't. Shield Maidens lived in the same strange space as Seder men, tolerated if useful, respected if victorious, but never quite allowed to be ordinary. And when women formed close bonds with other women, it was dismissed as sisterhood, as training companionship, because what else could it be? But you know the difference. A shared cloak in winter, a glance held too long when spears clashed in practice, an oath made not to a god, but to each other, sealed in blood beneath the birches. There's no law against it, no rune that bans it. But that doesn't mean it was safe. You meet another name in passing. Freydis Eirik's daughter, half hero, half controversy, daughter of Eric the Red. In one tale, she's a fierce fighter, defending a settlement from native attacks in Vinland by grabbing a sword while pregnant and chasing off enemies by sheer force of will. In another, she's accused of betrayal and murder. The contrast tells you more about her time than about her deeds. A woman who didn't conform had to be either a legend or a villain, never simply human. You think of an unnamed shield maiden whose existence was only discovered because of her grave, found in Birka, Sweden, laid to rest with a full warrior set, swords, armour, horses. At first, archaeologists assumed the body was male. When testing revealed it was female, the debate exploded. Surely she must have been ceremonial. Surely a mistake, but the grave said otherwise. She was buried not as a wife, not as a mother, as a commander, and still some historians hesitated to call her what she was. This tells you something deeply familiar, that even centuries later, we still struggle to believe that those who defy gender roles can lead, can love, can exist without explanation. Shield maidens weren't just warriors. They were a rupture in the fabric of what Viking womanhood was supposed to be. And those who shared their lives, their tents, and maybe more, they too were erased under the guise of discipline and martial respect. But if you listen between the clang of sword and shield, you'll hear it. Laughter that lingers too long after nightfall. A lullaby not meant for children. A name spoken like a prayer just before battle. And though their stories were rarely written, their footsteps still press into the earth, quiet but unshakable. The silent laws. Until the law stepped in, not with clarity, but with its own brand of silence. You sift now through the brittle pages of Viking legal codes, the grim heart of Norse justice, and what you find is strangely uneven. You expect to see thunderbolts, harsh decrees, maybe even dramatic punishments scrolled beside accusations of same-gender love, but instead you find hesitation, vague words, missing lines, a quiet where a verdict should be. Unlike later Christian laws, Viking-era codes don't outright ban homosexuality. There is no sweeping condemnation carved into birch bark or etched in stone. Instead, what you find is a fixation on shame, on reputation, on whether someone has been dishonoured, not whether they have loved. Take the Gragas, the medieval Icelandic law code. It does mention male-male intimacy, but only through the lens of insult, of dominance, of accusing a man of being a Gyr. What's punishable isn't the act itself, but the insult implying it. The legal concern is the shattering of status, not the emotion, not the intimacy. You start to see the shape of something strange, a world that feared reputation more than love. Still, there were consequences. You couldn't marry someone of the same sex. Marriage was tied to inheritance, land, and family alliances, and women, especially if they chose to live outside the expected roles, could find themselves cut off, disinherited, quietly exiled from their clan. But again, it was rarely about the act. It was about the disruption, the break in lineage, the way your existence challenged the structure. You remember a story passed down in whispers from a coastal farmstead of two women, Ursa and Dagny, who ran off together to live in the high valleys. They took sheep, tools, and the family's best spinning wheel. When Dagny's father found their hut a year later, he didn't drag them home. He took the wheel and left. That was his statement. Not violence, but disownment. The kind of punishment that leaves no scars on the skin, but plenty on the soul. For men, consequences often came in layers. If a man of low status was accused of same-gender intimacy and lacked allies, he might find himself refused trade, blocked from feasts, or, worst of all, laughed at. Not jailed, just dismissed. And in a society built on communal strength, laughter could be lethal. There's a case recorded in the fragments about a man named Snar, once a skilled rune carver. He was accused of behaving like a woman after a bitter rival spread stories about his closeness with a foreign guest. No duel was fought, no court was held, but Snar's commissions dried up. The local Jarl never called for him again. Within 2 winters he was gone, his workshop taken over by a younger man who carved with less grace but made no enemies. And yet, there were moments when love endured. You come across a note, just a side mention in an inheritance dispute. 2 men, Skeggy and Jorund, had lived together for over 20 years. One died. The other claimed their shared land. The family protested, but the court ruled in Jorund's favour. Not because they were lovers, no one said that, but because the village recognised their bond as valid, as real, even without a name for it. And maybe that's the strangest part. The law didn't know how to name what it couldn't control, so it danced around it, punished it sideways, acknowledged it only when it had to. You can feel the tension crackling beneath the surface. This wasn't a culture of openness, but it wasn't one of total denial either. Viking law didn't hunt down queerness the way later religious courts would. It tolerated it, avoided it, sidestepped, and when necessary it pretended not to see. But people lived in that gap. They built lives there, on shaky legal ground and strong private bonds, and sometimes that was just enough. The stones that speak. But when words failed and law looked away, the truth still surfaced in the dirt, the stones, the graves left behind. Because the dead can't lie, and their burial choices sometimes whisper what the living dared not say aloud. This is what burial tells us, what mattered most at the end, who you were, what you wanted to take with you, and sometimes who you loved. There are graves across the Norse world that challenge the neat categories of masculine and feminine. A body buried in what appears to be women's clothing, but with male anatomy. A man laid to rest with glass beads and a brooch in the traditional female style. The positions of the grave goods, the orientation of the body, the items they chose to carry into the next world, they all speak louder than the laws ever did. You come across a burial in Gotland, a person dressed in robes, surrounded by weaving tools and a few runic charms, laid next to another of the same sex. The records call it unusual, but that's only because the categories didn't stretch far enough to hold them. And then there are the graves that hold 2 paired burials, rare but real, 2 men side by side with no record of blood relation, no mention of combat, just together. Often one slightly turned toward the other. It's not proof, but it's presence, and presence matters. You think of a tale from the far north of Kjell and Arvid, 2 men who lived in a fishing hut for 30 years, long after anyone else on that coastline stayed. When they died in the same storm, the village buried them together under a stone with no carvings. Years later, someone returned and etched one word: home. Burial practices often reflected how someone lived, or how their community chose to remember them, which means even in death there were choices. Were you buried with a sword or a spindle, a drinking horn or a comb, your father's axe or your lover's necklace? In a grave found near Hedeby, archaeologists uncovered a skeleton buried with both a sword on one side, a set of fine textile tools on the other. Male anatomy, a body that seemed to walk both paths. Maybe they were a warrior, maybe a weaver, or maybe both, maybe neither. We don't know the names, we don't know the stories, but the graves are real, and they don't lie. What they do, though, is resist. They resist the tidy labels historians try to stamp onto them. They resist the idea that gender, love, and purpose can be divided neatly. They speak in contradiction, in blended roles, in silence that holds shape. You realize now, where the sagas dodged, the graves testified, where the laws avoided, the dead revealed. These quiet earthen testaments stand against the noise of judgment. They remind us that Vikings were not monoliths of masculinity, not statues of strength. They were people, complicated, contradictory, layered, and in the soil beneath your feet some of them are still speaking, and if you're quiet enough, they're not hard to hear. The Christian Quill. Though you may have to listen through layers of translation, judgment, and smoke from another kind of fire, because once the Vikings stopped speaking for themselves, others rushed in to speak for them. You turn now to the parchment-stained voices of Christian chroniclers, the monks, the missionaries, the distant observers, cloaked not in furs but in cassocks. They came with crosses, yes, but also with ink, and they rewrote the sagas, not with axes or runes, but with tidy Latin sentences and the moral certainty of men who had never once sailed a longship. They did not understand the intimacy of shared cloaks or the softness between warriors. They didn't see cider as sacred or silence as survival. What they saw, they misnamed, and what they feared, they condemned. Take Saxo Grammaticus, who wrote of the Norse with the polished sneer of a man both fascinated and appalled. He preserved stories of strong women like Lagertha, but coated them in disbelief, as though a woman holding a sword was a strange mistake of nature. When same-gender closeness crept into the narrative, he either ignored it or reshaped it into something grotesque. Viking affection became vice. Tenderness between men became mockery or worse, evidence of corruption. And so, slowly, the image of the Viking shifted, no longer a complicated human capable of contradictions, now a brute, a savage, a beast, tamed only by the light of Christ. You can feel it in the language. Words like sodomy and unnatural appear like smudges over older, subtler truths. The old gods become demons, the old ways become perversions. What was once myth, memory, or love becomes something to be burned. But the monks didn't erase everything. In their horror, they left fingerprints, accusations that reveal more than they intended. When a Christian writer warns that Norsemen share beds too easily, or mourn each other too deeply, he's not just preaching, he's reporting, accidentally preserving what he hoped would disappear. You imagine one of them, let's call him Brother Anselm, crouched over a desk in a stone monastery, ink-stained fingers trembling as he records a tale told to him by a Norse convert. The tale is simple. Two men, bonded not by blood but by choice, living together in the mountains, growing old beside one another. Anselm frowns. He doesn't understand. He writes it down anyway, but adds a warning. Such customs lead men into darkness. He seals it with a cross. And in doing so, he preserves it. This is how queerness survived, not through approval, but through obsession. Not because the monks accepted it, but because they couldn't stop circling it. They couldn't understand why some men didn't marry, why some women refused husbands, why grief could burn so hot between people who weren't kin. So they recorded it with suspicion and gave us centuries later faint echoes of what they wished would fade. But suspicion leaves a trail, and sometimes a trail is all you need. So you keep following it, past the pulpits and the polished Latin, into the wild, wind-beaten edges of the Viking world, where love didn't always need permission to exist. Traders and travellers, love beyond the fjords. You sail now, not across oceans of war, but across trade routes, merchant alleys, and the soft murmur of markets that stretch from the icy north to the golden sands of distant cities. Because the Vikings were not just raiders, they were traders, explorers, diplomats when it suited them. And with every voyage, they didn't just bring home spices, glassware, and silver. They brought back stories, customs, sometimes even lovers, from far beyond their fjords. You find yourself walking through Hedeby, one of the largest trading towns of the Norse world. It hums with many tongues: Arabic, Greek, Slavic, Old Norse. There are silks here, peacocks, coins from Baghdad. The smell of foreign incense curls through the streets like a secret. In this place the lines between cultures blur, and so do the rules. Here, a Norseman named Svein might share a stall with a merchant from the Abbasid Caliphate. They speak in gestures at first, then broken trade words. They smile. They meet again soon. They drink together at dusk. Soon after that, perhaps they share more than wine. Is it love? Companionship? A transaction? You'll never know. But it happens. It had to. Because this is what people do when borders shrink and curiosity outpaces fear. One Arabic traveller, Ahmad ibn Fadlan, wrote extensively about the Norse he encountered along the Volga. He marvelled at their customs, some crude, some fascinating. While his descriptions were sometimes dismissive, they also hinted at a kind of openness that disturbed him. He noted their bathing habits, their ritual cleanliness, their comfort with nudity. He noticed, too, how they touched one another, not always violently, not always with the reserve expected in his world. That tension, the one between what was happening and what could be written, is everywhere in these travel accounts. The writers often condemned, but they couldn't look away, and their discomfort leaves you clues. Imagine a man like Eric, a Norse trader who spends half the year sailing and the other half in the bustling city of Constantinople, where Vikings served as Varangian guards. He learns the local customs, learns the language, shares a home with another guard named Demetrius. They spar together, feast together, sleep in a narrow stone room with a single hearth. They call each other brother, but that word stretches beyond blood. No one questions it, because no one wants to break the quiet balance of what's mutually convenient and privately understood. That was the rule of the road. Don't name it, don't challenge it, just let it be. In far-off eastern cities, among domes and minarets, Viking men saw a different model of masculinity, one not always defined by loud violence, but by poetry, wisdom, even softness, and some brought those impressions home. Maybe not in stories told at the feast hall, but in how they carried themselves, in how they remembered a voice, a touch. Some even converted to Islam, not because they were conquered, but because they were moved. They built homes abroad, married foreign partners, lived in translation for the rest of their days, and in doing so, they stepped further from the hard lines of northern tradition, and closer to something freer, if more uncertain. You can feel it in the artifacts: a comb with Arabic script, a necklace with a foreign charm, a small glass bottle of oil found in a Norse grave far from any desert. Trade wasn't just commerce, it was intimacy, cultural, emotional, physical. And so you realise, queerness in the Viking world didn't always grow in defiance. Sometimes it travelled, smuggled in between bolts of silk and sacks of saffron, hidden in laughter between two men who didn't share a language but shared something else, something older, something universal. And when they parted, because most did, the memory stayed. Because longing, like trade, leaves marks. The wild spaces of freedom. And now you follow that longing, not on ships or trade routes this time, but into the woods, the rivers, the remote fjords where no laws reached and no one watched. Because even in a society thick with expectations, silence could still carve space for freedom. You step into the twilight of a Norse forest clearing. The trees groan in the wind like old gods muttering. The land is vast, quiet, and blessedly wild. This is where those who didn't quite fit often ended up, not exiled, but self-removed. Herbalists, spirit workers, warriors who'd seen too much, and sometimes lovers who could never be lovers in the open. There were names for these places: hidden farms, secluded cabins, remote fishing villages, places where everyone knew but no one asked, places where two women might live together as widows or spinsters when neither had ever been married, where two men might build a boat together and never once speak of why neither took a wife. Because when the world is harsh, what matters most is that someone shares your fire. There are sagas quietly whispered of shield maidens who would not marry, of men who wandered into the forest and came back changed, clothed differently, speaking in riddles, but wiser. There's one story of a woman named Hervor, who dressed as a man and fought with sword and flame, refusing all roles handed to her. She reclaimed her father's enchanted blade from his ghost. Her tale is one of power, but also of slipping through gender's grip like mist through fingers. These tales were not always condemned. Some were admired, even feared. Because in the Viking mind, to live on your own terms, especially in defiance of what was expected, meant you had strength, maybe even magic. And this is where queerness often hid in plain sight, behind the veil of the mysterious, the odd, the sacred. The concept of Aegir might have been used to insult, but in these woods, no one spoke that word. There was no need. What you were didn't matter as much as whether you could hunt, build, heal, protect, or simply stay kind. Consider the archaeological find near Birka, a grave once thought to belong to a high-status male warrior, until closer study revealed the buried person may have been biologically female. Some scholars pushed back. It was too confusing, they argued. But the bones didn't lie. nor did the weapons, the position of power, the clear military honour in that grave. Perhaps the person was a woman who lived as a man, or perhaps they were something else entirely, something we don't have modern words for. But the Vikings made room for them in death, that's the clue. These woods remember all of them, the ones who broke rules not out of rebellion, but because their hearts asked them to, the quiet husbands who left their villages together and never returned, the sisters of spirit who gathered herbs and stories under the same roof until the end of their days. They may not be named in poems, but they are buried beneath stones you can still visit if you know where to walk and when to listen. So much of queer Viking history is whispered, not erased but disguised, not lost but translated into metaphors, into the soft space between words. Because sometimes survival meant silence, sometimes freedom meant solitude, but always it meant someone remembered. And tonight, that someone is you. And as you stand there in the quiet of those woods, where truth was worn like a second skin, hidden but never forgotten, you begin to understand something deeper. Queerness wasn't just tucked into the shadows. It also danced in the fires, echoed in the laughter, and whispered in the prayers of those who called the far north home. There's an old story still told in parts of northern Iceland, though most forget its meaning. It speaks of a reclusive weaver named Eric, who spun threads so fine it shimmered like moonlight on snow. Eric never spoke of his past, nor did anyone press him, but the local children adored him, especially for the riddles he wove into his cloth. One winter, when a merchant tried to marry off his daughter for land, she fled straight to Eric's cottage. He took her in, taught her to weave her own story, and in spring she left, dressed not in bridal white, but in dyed wool the colour of stormy seas. When asked, she said, "He taught me to live untied." Whether Eric loved men or simply refused to play a man's role, no one knew or needed to. He belonged to a quiet brotherhood of those who bent the loom of life in their own way. There were many such weavers of fate in Norse mythology. The very act of spinning thread and shaping destiny was a sacred task, one often linked to the feminine, but not exclusively. The Norns, those mysterious beings who controlled the threads of all lives, defied gender in many tellings. Some scholars suggest that spiritual figures who dressed or behaved outside expected norms may have been seen as closer to divine forces, neither fully man nor woman, but a bridge between. In this light, queerness wasn't always an aberration. Sometimes it was a blessing, a gift, a reason to listen more closely. That might explain why some Viking-era sorcerers, particularly male ones known as cedar men, were both feared and revered. Practicing cedar as a man carried social risk, since it involved stepping into a realm considered feminine, yet some did it anyway. Were they shamed? Sometimes. Were they ignored? Never, because their knowledge worked. Crops grew, illnesses faded, storms passed, and behind every insult lay a trembling respect. It makes you wonder how many truths live double lives, how many names, like the flickering runes carved into bone, told more than one story depending on how you held them to the light. The Norse didn't have our vocabulary. They didn't talk about non-binary or fluid identities with modern terms, but they lived alongside people who simply were, who shaped their place in the world not by proclamation, but by presence, by skill, by staying. And though many were buried quietly, their legacies did not stay dead. When archaeologists uncover graves where a male skeleton rests with brooches traditionally worn by women, or where warrior tools rest beside textile instruments, the modern mind fumbles. But perhaps the Vikings didn't. Perhaps they understood something we've only just begun to remember, that the soul's truth can't be contained in a single name, a single box, a single role. They honoured the whole, even if they didn't always explain it. And so, as you leave the clearing, the wind lifts your cloak like a benediction. Somewhere in the distance a raven cries, and you know, queerness didn't just survive the Viking Age, it carved itself into the story. It built homes in the silence, it whispered, and was heard. The fading echoes. You keep walking further now, past mossy stones and buried roots, until the trees seem to hush the world around you. In this deep quiet, the past feels near again, and so does something else. The persistent question that always lingers at the edge of history: what happened next? Because the saga of queerness in Viking lands didn't end with a soft footfall in snow. It clashed with fire and sword. It collided with the arrival of something vast, something that would change the very sky under which these stories were told: Christianity. At first, it came slowly, missionaries arriving with words instead of axes, offering eternity in exchange for transformation. Some communities resisted. Others blended old rites with the new. But over time, as the cross replaced the hammer, a shift took hold. Identities once held in complexity were now marked in sin. You can imagine how it began. A bishop frowning at the cider men, calling their practice unmanly. A monk rewriting a tale, turning a once sacred ritual into a scandal. A king seeking unity through conformity, stamping out the odd, the untamed, the in-between. And still, queer people endured, even when the law turned against them. Records from medieval Iceland tell us that by the 13th century, male-male intimacy was punishable by death, burning, or beheading. These laws didn't appear in a vacuum. They mirrored growing church influence across Europe, where sodomy became a word so broad it swallowed up truth and left only fear. But behind every law was a face, a name, a heartbeat. One such name was Jon Rögnvaldsson, a man executed in 1625 in Iceland during one of the country's few witch trials. Though remembered as a sorcerer, some oral traditions whisper that he lived apart, dressed strangely, kept company most often with men. The truth is tangled, but one detail remains. He was accused not just of magic, but of disturbing the order, of being different. Then there's the 14th century account from Norway about a woman who lived as a man and worked as a shipbuilder, who even married another woman. When discovered, she was brought before the court. But the verdict? Not a simple punishment. The court wrestled with the matter for days because how do you judge what doesn't fit your mould but clearly exists? And still, queer people persisted. Some disguised, some fled, some survived by silence, others by song. In the Faroe Islands, folktales speak of shapeshifters, creatures neither man nor beast, neither one thing nor another. Were these metaphors for those who lived outside gender? Perhaps. Or perhaps they were reminders that not everything strange was cursed, that some things strange were sacred. The church tried to erase, to cleanse, to rewrite, but even it could not fully unweave the threads that had been spun for centuries. Queer identities became quieter, yes, but not invisible, not lost. In household sagas, a bachelor uncle might appear, always present, never married, oddly close with a travelling merchant. In the graveyards, a warrior's stone might bear no wife's name but another man's. In lullabies, a line or two would change slightly, carrying double meaning for those who knew how to listen. And the knowing never died. Even today, Iceland stands as one of the most progressive nations on Earth when it comes to LGBTQ+ rights. But that's not an accident of modernity. It's the persistence of memory, the result of centuries where queer people refuse to vanish, refuse to be erased. It's why the modern queer Icelandic poet Sjón often says that he writes as if weaving the future from the forgotten ends of old yarn. So here, at the edge of this forest of time, you understand something else. The legacy of queerness in Viking history isn't just survival, it's testimony to the human spirit, to those who refuse to be told who they could be, and to those still writing sagas with their own lives, in the same fierce wind. The fierce reality of Viking life. The stories whispered through ancient runes and buried beneath layers of frost point to one truth. Viking society was far more complex than legend lets on. Hidden within sagas and bones are echoes of queer lives, of love, ritual, shame and resilience. Whether in the sorcerer's trance, the warrior's silent companionship, or the figure who defied gender to live authentically, the presence of queerness is undeniable. Or is it? Now we turn to you. Do you believe homosexuality truly existed in Viking times? Or are we weaving modern ideas into old myths? Could the truth be both stranger and richer than we imagined? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's open a conversation that history once tried to silence, because the past doesn't belong to just one voice. It belongs to all who dare to ask, what have we forgotten and why? You wake up sore again, the haze still in your hair, and your hands are cracked from yesterday's cold. As your body stretches, aching from another night on an uneven wooden frame, you catch a whiff. Unmistakable, unavoidable, and it's coming from you. But in the Viking age, dealing with that isn't simple. You want to wash? Everyone wants to wash, but that's not something you do casually. Not when clean water is locked under sheets of ice or a long walk from the settlement. So you trudge down to the riverbank. It's winter. The air bites through the linen you're wrapped in, and as you break the frost over the stream with your stiff hands, you hesitate. Do you really want to submerge your face in that? Your skin's already raw from wind and smoke, but this is your best chance. So you grit your teeth, scoop up a freezing handful and splash. It burns like fire. There's no soap. Not really. The Vikings sometimes used a kind of lye soap made from animal fat and ash, but that's not something you carry around, and it stings if you've got cuts or scrapes, which you almost certainly do. So for today, it's just icy water, and a prayer that no one comes close enough to notice how bad you smell. Hair, oh yes, you still have to manage that. Vikings are often portrayed with sleek braids and immaculate beards, but the truth? Lice were a constant companion. Combs carved from bone or antler were one of the most personal and important tools. You dig one out of your pouch and start scraping, tugging painfully at your tangled scalp. Every few passes you check for lice or nits. You find some, of course you do. Everybody does. You pick them out, toss them away and keep combing. The comb is public and private all at once. You don't share it. It's one of your few weapons in the war against filth. But grooming isn't vanity, it's survival. Filth brings disease. Disease brings weakness. And weakness gets you killed or replaced. Your fingernails are black with soot from the hearth and yesterday's work. You try to clean under them with a sliver of bone. It's not working. Your hands are stained and cracked, but at least now they look less like a blacksmith's and more like a farmer's. And then there's your clothes. They haven't been washed in days, weeks if you're honest. Laundering means boiling water, scrubbing wool with harsh soap, beating it on rocks, then waiting days for it to dry in a damp climate. That's a luxury most can't afford regularly. So you live with the smell. You get used to it. Everybody smells. You just hope yours isn't worse than theirs. Women have their own burdens. Hair tucked beneath scarves or caps to avoid both lice and judgment. Washing their bodies privately, if they can, with the same icy water or heated leftovers from the cooking pots. Dignity is a delicate thing here, easily lost, hard to maintain. Dental care? You chew twigs or rinse with salt water. If you're lucky, your teeth hurt. There's a black spot on your molar you've been ignoring. You touch it with your tongue and wince. There are no dentists, no sweet-smelling mint pastes, just patience and pain. And yet, despite all this, Vikings valued grooming. Appearance mattered. A clean beard could show social status. Braided hair meant you had time, and time meant power. Some carved ear scoops or tweezers to pick out wax or hairs, because even in a world of mud and blood, there's still pride. But today your pride is soggy and frozen. You're half wet, your sleeves stiff with frost where the water splashed, and your hands have gone numb. You dry them on your tunic, which only makes you colder. The chores are calling and you haven't even eaten, and somehow you're still not clean. You walk back to the longhouse, shivering. Your face stings from the water and your feet are still wet from the ice-crusted ground. You push open the thick wooden door, expecting warmth. But what greets you first isn't heat. It's smoke. Again. It always is. The hearth sits low in the centre of the room. Its coals smoulder under yesterday's ash, and a fresh log just added by someone trying to boil porridge or dry wet boots. But there's no chimney, only a small opening in the roof, and it's doing a poor job today. The smoke curls upward, gets stuck in the rafters, then spreads sideways, slowly, inevitably. It fills the house like mist on a still lake. You cough. You try to sit low, closer to the cleanest air. It's an old trick, everyone knows it. The lower you are, the less you breathe in the haze. Children crawl around half-crouch for this reason, and the elders often sit near the door, wrapped in cloaks, braving the draft just to breathe easier. The smoke clings to your clothes, your hair, your bedding. You sleep in it, you eat in it, and you breathe it until your eyes sting and your throat aches. In winter, the fires never stop. In summer, they're needed for cooking and keeping flies away. There is no escaping it. And yet somehow, this is survival. Smoke preserves meat, dries fish, hardens wood, and chokes out pests. It was better than the mould and rot that came without it. The Viking Age longhouse was not just a home, it was a living system, and the smoke was its circulatory haze, irritating but essential. You glance around and see someone waving a cloak, trying to fan it toward the roof hole. Futile. There's no real draft, not unless someone opens the door and lets in another gust of winter. But that brings another problem. Cold. So you stay trapped in this fog, lungs burning, eyes watering. At night, it's worse. The doors are shut tight, the fire is banked for warmth, and the roof hole often iced over. You lie on your straw bedding, blinking through the haze. Some families have animals indoors, sheep or chickens, and their breath only adds to the fog. Between smoke, sweat, animals, and damp wool, the air turns thick enough to chew. Still, you have to be alert. Sparks sometimes jump, and a stray ember can set an entire wall ablaze. The longhouse is made of timber and thatch, and if fire takes hold, it doesn't ask permission. You've seen it happen in nearby villages. Homes reduced to charred beams and wet ashes in minutes. The elders say the gods can see clearer through smoke, that the haze is part of the ritual. Offerings rise with it. You don't know if that's true, but you do know this. Every breath you take in here shortens something. You can feel it in your chest, in the tightness when you run outside, in the way old people wheeze. Children often have coughs that never go away. The very young especially struggle to breathe at night. In wealthier homes, sometimes there's a small smoke loft or extra space above the hearth for heat to gather. But in yours, everyone shares the same space, the same air, the same sting in the throat. Even the walls sweat with it. Over time, the smoke blackens the beams and the cob walls, leaving soot streaks where it curls and pools. Your hands come away dirty after touching anything above shoulder height. You've stopped wearing pale colours, not that you had many to begin with. And yet, even this dense, choking gloom becomes background noise. It seeps into your senses until you barely notice, until you step outside and your lungs pull in that first deep, fresh breath. And it burns. Not from smoke, but from the raw cold of clean air you forgot still existed. The day presses on. The smoke doesn't leave. It wraps around you like another skin, invisible but clinging. A reminder that comfort in this world is never free. It always comes at the cost of something. Your sight, your breath, your silence. You grab the bowl of weak porridge someone left near the coals and sit beside the wall. Your eyes water as the smoke curls toward your face. You wipe them with your sleeve, already crusted with salt from yesterday's tears. And then you eat, because there's nothing else to do, no other place to go. And you know that even when the fire dies down, the haze will stay, floating there, silent and patient, waiting to be fed again. You finish your porridge slowly, not because you're savouring it, but because once it's gone, there won't be more until the evening. Or maybe not even then. It's the same porridge you've had for days, oats boiled with water, thickened with yesterday's leftovers if you're lucky, or sprinkled with a pinch of salt if someone remembered. You don't eat for pleasure, you eat to stop the ache. The fire crackles beside you as you scrape the wooden bowl clean, trying not to think about how long it will be until your next meal. Hunger here isn't a passing feeling, it's a companion. It lingers through the day like the smoke, settling in your gut, numbing your mind, always present in the background of everything you do. There are no feasts in this part of the world, unless someone is getting married, giving birth or dying, and even then they're modest. The image of Vikings gnawing meat from bones, surrounded by roaring fires and flowing mead. That's the dream of poets and skalds, not the reality you live. Most days your meals are whatever you can stretch from the stores. Flat barley bread, coarse and hard from being left out too long. Dried peas boiled into mush. A piece of dried fish if the sea has been kind. Root vegetables pulled from the earth. Turnips, onions, maybe a parsnip if the ground wasn't too frozen to dig. It's repetitive, it's bland, but it keeps you upright. Meat is rare. Animals are more valuable alive for milk, wool, labour and manure. A slaughtered animal is a statement, either celebration or desperation. You remember the last time a goat was killed. It was thin, sickly, and already near death. The meat was stringy and smelled off, but nobody said a word as they cooked it. Hunger silences pride. You sometimes dream of butter, not because it's your favourite, but because it's soft, rich, and almost luxurious, compared to the cracked bread and water-thin stew you're used to. A smear of butter on a hot flat cake, pulled from the pan at just the right time. That, in your world, is indulgence. There are moments when someone tries to add flavour. Wild herbs, thyme, marjoram, mustard leaves are foraged and thrown into the pot. In spring, a young girl brought back a handful of sorrel, and its lemony bite transformed a whole meal. Everyone noticed, everyone remembered. But spices? Those belong to kings, to merchants sailing from lands so far away their names sound like spells. You've heard of pepper, cloves, cinnamon, but only from travellers or from priests whispering about the East. You will never taste them. You may never even see them. You look at the others in the longhouse. A child sucks on a boiled turnip, scraping it with his teeth like it's the leg of a chicken. An old woman dips stale bread into broth and lets it soften before gumming it down. No one complains. Complaining uses energy, and energy is precious. And yet, even here, food is ceremony. The first harvest is celebrated. A well-caught fish is passed around like treasure. At solstice, people prepare special bread, sometimes pressed with carved patterns, and they burn a piece as an offering. There is dignity still in the ritual of eating, even when the food itself barely satisfies. You remember one winter, long ago, when the snow never stopped and the stores ran low. A family in the next village boiled bark. The children cried from the pain of it, stomachs swollen, the fibres too rough. They survived, but barely, and no one judged them. Everyone knew that if it lasted another week, they would have done the same. Even now, you count each meal in your mind. You remember how much grain is left, how many onions are still buried in straw, how many dried fish still hang in the rafters. You think in numbers. 3 more days of oats, 5 more roots, 1 more slab of salt pork hidden at the back, saved for the day the baby is born or the elder dies. Food here isn't about fullness, it's about holding on, a way to measure time until spring, a quiet rebellion against hunger's constant knocking. And so you stand up, brush crumbs from your lap, and carry your bowl to the water bucket. You scoop, rinse, and hang it by the wall, ready for the next round. Ready for another meal of survival, not satisfaction. You don't expect pleasure from your next bite. You expect just enough to keep walking, just enough to keep thinking, just enough to make it through one more smoky, bitter, hungry day. You barely notice it now. The musky mix of smoke, sweat, and livestock has settled into your skin like a second cloak. Your tunic, stained from work and weeks of wear, clings to your body with the heaviness of unwashed wool. There is no perfume, no soap beyond what's boiled from leftover animal fat and ashes, and even that is reserved for rare occasions or the hands of the midwife. No one around you smells any better. The entire village shares the same stench, so the air itself feels thick with it. Bathing is not routine, it's a ritual, and a risky one at that. Water, when cold, can steal the life from your lungs. Firewood is scarce, and heating a whole tub is a luxury for the wealthy or for saints' feast days. Maybe once a week, if the weather allows, and someone's in a generous mood, you'll get a basin to splash your face, armpits, and feet. A full soak? That's a memory from childhood, or a future hope. You've seen the stream run after a washing, bits of hay, flecks of skin, the smears of a long day's labour floating away. But the water doesn't carry the smell with it, not really. The sweat of weeks past returns before you even finish drying your hair, especially when your chores begin again the moment you're dressed. You know this is how it is for everyone. The farmer smells of cows and soil, the leatherworker reeks of tannin and rot, the fisherfolk carry the sharp perfume of scales and brine. Even the priest, cloaked in robes, wears the scent of candle smoke and mildew. You can't escape it. You don't try. You just learn to stop noticing. And yet, you've met outsiders, traders from across the sea or nobles visiting on pilgrimage, who recoil when they step into your world. Their faces twist, their sleeves cover their noses. You don't need to be told you smell. Their eyes say it plainly. But what do they expect? You don't have access to rosemary water, fine linens or scented oils. You have ashes and maybe, if you're lucky, a handful of crushed mint leaves once the herbs come in spring. You remember one of the monks talking about the Romans, how they bathed daily, soaked in hot water, scraped oils from their skin. You laughed, not because it's funny, but because it sounds like a fantasy. Who has that kind of time, that kind of fuel, that kind of water? Still, you try in small ways. On feast days you'll rinse your hands and face, maybe rub your hair with a cloth. Some women braid in dried lavender, or wear sachets of herbs around their necks. Men might scrape their beards or brush their teeth with salt and ash. It's not much, but it's something. A gesture toward dignity in a world where filth always finds you. You've seen people judged for smelling worse than the norm. Usually the sick or the poor, beyond poor, the ones who sleep in damp corners, who haven't eaten enough to sweat, who can't carry their own waste far enough away from the home. Their scent is different, sour, sharp, unsettling. It marks them, warns others not just of poverty, but of danger. Sometimes, death follows that smell. There are places where the stench is unbearable. The outhouse the tanner's shed, the piles of manure left too long in the sun. But even there you endure. You cover your face with a sleeve, breathe through your mouth, and keep moving. What else can you do? Sometimes, when the wind is right, the scent of pine needles or fresh rain will cut through the grime, and for a moment you remember what clean used to feel like, not just on the skin, but in the lungs and the soul. It passes quickly. The next animal must be fed. The next chore must be done. You live in a world where the cleanest scent is the smell of smoke on your tunic, because it means warmth, because it means the food was cooked, because it means you survived another day. So, no, you don't smell good, but neither does anyone else. And that, in its own strange way, is comforting. You are not alone in the stink. You are not separate from the struggle. You are part of it. A walking, breathing reminder that this life is lived close to the earth, raw and real. And perhaps long after you're gone, someone will find your bones and wonder how you lived. They'll never know the smell, but you did. Every single day. You don't eat sweets, not really. The idea of dessert, something just for pleasure, something at the end of a meal to make you smile, is as foreign to your world as flying carpets or singing angels. Sugar exists, but it's locked away behind monastery walls or packed into tiny pouches on spice caravans that might pass through once in your lifetime. When it shows up, it's not eaten, it's prescribed to you. Sugar is a treatment, not a treat. It might be stirred into bitter herbal brews to help someone swallow them. It might be mixed into a poultice for a festering wound, or given to a noble woman who's fainted from heat in the blood. You've heard that royal doctors sometimes crush pearls with sugar to make a tonic for the dying, but you're not royalty. You're just a soul trying to make it to winter. What you do have sometimes is honey, but even that is a gift from the gods, or at least from bees brave enough to build hives near your fields. Beekeeping is a sacred skill, guarded and passed down. Honey is sticky gold, and when it graces your table, it's a moment worth remembering. Maybe a smear on a crust of coarse rye bread during Easter. Maybe a spoonful in a gruel when someone's been sick and needs cheering. But more often, it's saved for holy days, for saints' feasts, weddings, births, or death rites. You taste it, and it sings. But then it's gone, and you're back to cabbage and onions. So when you crave something sweet, you turn to what you have. Berries in the late summer if the birds haven't stolen them first. Roasted chestnuts, not sugary, but soft and warm and almost sweet after hours in the coals. You might dry plums or apples in the sun, threading them on strings to hang from your rafters. When hunger stretches thin, even these feel like candy. You remember once a merchant's child dropped a stick of candied almond on the road. You found it, half melted and dust-covered. You licked it anyway, and for that moment, the world shifted. You tasted almonds and roses, and something you'd later learn was saffron. You never tasted it again, but you never forgot. There's a rumour, always a rumour, of nobles who eat glazed pears, of convents where marzipan is shaped into little lambs for the nativity. Some say there are entire banquets with candied violets, sugar sculptures and pies that spill dates and cinnamon when sliced. But these might as well be fairy tales. You've never seen them. You've never even met anyone who has. And yet, on feast days, something magical does happen. The village women gather what they can, barley flour, goose fat, dried fruit, and fry little cakes over the hearth. They're hard, dense, often burnt on the outside, but if someone had saved a pinch of honey or dried mint, they might mix it in. These are your sweets. You eat them hot and fast, with the excitement of a child and the reverence of a monk, because this is what joy tastes like in your world. You've heard stories of the ancient world, of Roman honey cakes and Egyptian date syrups, of Persian sweets wrapped in gold leaf. It feels distant, like another planet. But maybe, just maybe, one of your ancestors once tasted those things. Maybe sweetness is buried in your bones. But for now, you return to your salted fish, your root stew, your oat porridge, and when your tongue remembers that one sweet bite from years ago, that burst of sun-warmed strawberry or a sliver of honey on festival bread, you hold on to it. Because in this life, joy is not cheap. It's fleeting, sacred, and always earned. In your world, thirst is dangerous. The stream looks clear, the well seems deep, but drink the wrong drop, and you might not wake up tomorrow. Dysentery, fevers, cramps that twist your gut like the devil's own fingers. Everyone knows someone who drank the wrong water. Even children learn early. Trust the alewife more than the river. So you drink ale every day. Everyone does, even the children. But this isn't the kind of ale that makes men shout or fight or fall into fire. It's small ale, brewed light and low, with just enough fermentation to kill the worst of the water's demons. It's cloudy, flat, and earthy, served from cracked jugs and old leather bottles. It won't make you merry, but it might keep you alive. You might remember your grandmother saying, "Better drunk than dead." Not because she meant it literally, but because in a village without physicians, sometimes the line between poison and potion is a muddy stream. Real drunkenness, though, the kind nobles indulge in, is something you only witness at weddings or on saints' days. That's when the stronger stuff comes out. Maybe a bitter mead from someone who keeps bees, maybe a fiery cider from the monks across the valley, maybe even a splash of wine if a generous priest, a passing merchant, or a harvest miracle brings a bottle into your village. Wine is a holy thing. In church you see the priest lift the chalice, and you know it's not for everyone. The taste of it, sharp, red, sacred, is a memory tied to ceremonies and caskets. You've sipped it only during communion, maybe once a year, and even then it's watered down. There's a story passed around about a man who drank nothing but clean spring water and lived to be 100. But that man lived in a poem, not in your fields. Here, even clear water can kill, and beer is a kind of medicine. At harvest time, when work is endless and sleep is brief, the ale flows more freely. You drink to quench your thirst, to soften your aches, and to shut out the moans of your joints. You don't drink to forget. You drink because it's the only thing safer than trusting your own well. In some rare seasons, the cider is good. The apples are plenty, the juice ferments just right. Those are the years you might feel a little lightheaded after supper or laugh too loudly at your neighbour's joke. For a moment, you feel rich. Not rich in coin, but in comfort. Monks and brewers understand the balance. Brew too strong, and the field workers sleep instead of sow. Brew too weak, and the sickness returns. So they measure, pray, and boil the mash, watching it foam like a cauldron of hope. What happens when you drink too much? You stumble, you sing, you might fall into the mud, but more often you just sleep deeper and dream a little softer than usual. You don't crave drunkenness, you crave safety. And in your world where hunger stalks and water deceives, the mug in your hand is more than a drink, it's survival. And if one night you drink a little too fast, your thoughts might wander. What does a Venetian merchant drink as he counts his gold? What wine flows in the castles where minstrels play and kings feast? Will you ever know the taste of something aged in a barrel, spiced like the tales in winter? You don't know, but tonight your ale is warm. It doesn't bite, and tomorrow, if you're lucky, you'll wake without fever and drink again. Bread is not a treat in your world. It is a duty, a daily grind, quite literally. You wake to its smell, sleep after it, chew it without joy. It is there to stop your stomach from shouting, nothing more. But even then, some days, not enough of it exists. Your bread is not white, not soft, not fragrant with yeast like the loaves they bake in noble ovens. Number. Your bread is black, heavy, coarse, made from rye, oats, barley, whatever your land can grow and your hands can thresh. Wheat, that's a dream for the rich, the monasteries, and the millers who take their cut before you even see the flour. You grind the grain with a quernstone, back bent, arms aching. If your village is lucky, there's a mill nearby powered by water or wind, but it costs coin or a toll in grain, and not everyone can spare it. So most grind by hand in dusty corners where flour dust coats the walls like pale soot. The dough is sticky, dark, and bitter. You knead it with cracked fingers and let it rise if you're lucky enough to have a starter saved from yesterday. If not, you bake it flat, like a sad, heavy cake. There is no butter, no honey, no fine ash to lighten the crust. Just flour, water, salt, and prayers. The oven is shared, or it's yours, a pit lined with stones, heated with dry branches, dung, or leftover coals. You bake your loaves alongside your neighbours. The best bread is dense and keeps for days, though it grows tougher each sunrise. The worst turns green by morning, mould spreading like moss across a wet stone. You eat the bread dry, or you dip it into broth if there's meat, into ale if there's nothing else. You feed it to your children first. You count slices with your eyes. You hide the last chunk beneath cloth so no one begs you for it. Hunger is always nearby, like a wolf pacing just beyond the firelight. Some seasons bring more grain, others bring none. When the rains fail, or the frost comes too early, or the lords demand more than you can give, your bread thins. You stretch it with ground beans, acorns, chestnuts, and sometimes you eat it knowing it will make your belly cramp. But it's that or nothing. There's an old saying, bread for the body, truth for the soul. But in times like these, even the body gets lied to. You remember the famine 2 winters past. The bread then was almost black with bark, ground fine and bitter. People whispered of families eating clay, of parents giving the last heel of bread to a baby that wouldn't wake in the morning. Those memories don't fade, they cling, even when the barn is full. Bread is political too. Lords hoard grain, monasteries seal it in barrels, town markets sell it dearer than gold. When war comes close, you've watched fights break out over a half loaf. You've seen a man beaten for stealing a roll. You've seen the baker weep because the flour ran out and 5 more families came knocking. And yet, it is bread that binds you. The blessing at the table, the peace offering, the harvest feast's first course. You break it together at weddings and funerals. Even when thin and cracked, it reminds you that you are alive, that you share this hunger with everyone around you. One day, a stranger from the road offered you a crust, white, fluffy, dotted with seeds. He said it came from a city far away, where bakers knead with strong arms and ovens roar like dragons. You tasted it and almost cried, not because it was good, but because it made you realize what you'd never had. Still, you returned to your bread, your black bread, your bitter, loyal companion, the one that never tastes sweet but is always there, until it isn't. There's a look people get when the food runs out. It's in the eyes, wild, red-rimmed, no longer curious, just desperate. You've seen it before. You've worn it yourself. Hunger doesn't simply weaken the body, it warps the spirit, makes enemies of friends, makes monsters of neighbours. When the grain sacks are empty and the root cellar holds only frost, kindness becomes a memory. You recall the winter when old May, the herb woman, bartered willow bark for a scrap of meat, and the next morning her hut was ransacked. No thief admitted to it, but no one denied it either. People whispered that someone found a spoon with dried blood on it, buried in her hearth ash. But hunger doesn't only breed cruelty, it also breeds ingenuity. You've watched mothers soak weeds and call it soup. You've seen young boys trap squirrels with twine and stones. Children learn which leaves numb the tongue and which flowers stew into something faintly sweet. Even moss has been boiled in your village, scraped from stones and flavoured with stale ale during the lean months. You've heard strange advice passed from one household to another. Boil nettles, but skim the foam. Roast the mice over green branches, not dry ones, they taste less like ash. Eat the bark only once you've dried it 3 days. Nothing is off limits when bellies cave inward. You've eaten things you never speak of. Once a traveller came through, offering a pie with a rich, greasy smell. He said it was goose, but no goose flies in frost. You chewed, you swallowed, and you never asked. You remember the baker's son, once round and pink, turning gaunt and sharp-boned by spring. One day he stopped sharing his crusts with the dogs. The next, the dogs were gone. And then one day, so was he. There are stories. Some you try not to believe. A mother who smothered one of her twins to feed the other. A man who dug up a buried cow long before the rot left it. A priest who fasted with holy pride until someone caught him gnawing marrow from a bone behind the altar. But hunger also teaches you cunning, how to stretch a meal into 3, how to flavour a broth with nothing but a heated stone, a spring sprig of mint, and imagination. How to fake fullness by chewing slowly and drinking hot water. You've learned to tighten belts, to silence the grumble with prayer, to hum while cooking so children think something better is coming. You've seen food used as a weapon, lords doubling taxes in famine years, forcing villagers to choose between bread and loyalty, monasteries locking their grain stores while preachers spoke of charity. Sometimes the cruelest thing isn't withholding food, it's letting people smell it and telling them, "Come back tomorrow." Still, hunger does more than punish, it binds. You've shared your last crust with a crying stranger and wept when they did the same. You've split a cold turnip 6 ways and made it feel like a feast. The cruel times reveal the clever, yes, but also the generous, the kind who still give even when they're starving. There's a phrase they say during bad harvests, empty hands make sharp knives. You understand now. It means more than theft. It means survival, desperation, transformation. It means that when all else is gone, hunger writes its own laws. And you live by them. Every meal is a victory. Every bite is a kind of defiance. You survive not because you feast, but because you refuse to let hunger hollow out your humanity completely. Not yet. In a world where clean water is a gamble, even bad ale is a blessing. You've drunk brews so thin they look like dishwater, so tart they curled your tongue, but you drank them anyway, because you had to, because the alternative might send you to the grave faster than the hunger ever could. The well in your village isn't pure. You know this. You've watched it cough up cloudy water in the spring, teeming with little things you can't see but always feel later. Cramps, fever, retching. People who drank only water died younger. The wise ones learned to brew, but brewing requires grain, and when grain is scarce, the ale gets weaker. The barley's barely there. A cup of it might taste more like hay or sour herbs than beer. Still, even that brew, thinned with water, soured in a clay jug, is safer than the stream. And so it becomes a daily ritual, a cup at dawn, another at dusk. A toast not to pleasure, but to survival. Children are raised on it. The old survive by it. Not because it's strong, but because it's boiled, fermented, cleansed by fire and time. Even monks sworn to simple lives make it in their abbeys, not just to sell, but to drink. Not to forget their troubles, but to keep the fever at bay. You remember one winter when the brew was so weak it barely frothed. People joked that the barrel must have cried instead of fermented. Still, No one poured it out. Even the bitterest batch was too precious to waste. It gave you something warm. It gave you something to hold. In the cities, taverns served it with pride, if they had enough grain. But for the poor, what passed as ale was often made with whatever could be found. Chestnuts, beans, even tree bark once ground fine. Some brewed nettle beer, others fermented crab apples until they fizzed like a curse. One neighbour even swore by a brew of turnip and honey. You never dared to ask for seconds. The quality varied by season. A harvest year might mean malty richness and a foam thick enough to rest a spoon on. A famine year meant brown liquid in chipped cups that smelled faintly of vinegar, but it was still safer than the well. You've seen ale used for healing, mixed with crushed herbs and bitter roots. You've seen it used to wash wounds when water ran black. You've seen midwives give it to birthing mothers to dull the pain. And you've seen drunks fall asleep by the hearth after one cup too many, though it barely counted as a real drink. Ale wasn't luxury, it was lifeline. It bound communities. Brew days were events. Women would gather with their pots and strains and stir the mash while gossiping. Children would sneak sips when backs were turned. Men would argue over strength and spice. Even the weakest brew carried warmth, comfort, ritual. There was power in the brewing. Not everyone could do it right. Let the mash sit too long and it's spoiled. Skip the herbs and it turned flat. But when done well, even the weakest ale carried the faintest sweetness of barley. A ghost of the feast it might have been in better times. So you drank, morning, noon and night, not to dull your mind, but to keep it clear, to stay upright, to keep the ache in your belly from turning into sickness, to survive another day. In the end, you don't remember the taste so much as the feeling of holding a warm cup between cold hands, of sipping slowly, pretending it was strong, of thanking the gods not for luxury, but for anything that wouldn't kill you. Because in times like these, even the weakest ale was stronger than the world trying to break you. You've never tasted saffron, but you've heard its name whispered like a charm. It's meant to be golden, rich, precious, something only the nobles would know. You've seen what they eat on the rare occasions the lord's retinue pass through the village. Carts clattering with cured hams, honeyed figs, baskets of almonds, wheels of cheese the size of cradles. You watched, always from a distance. You were not invited to the table, not even close. While you scraped the bottom of a pot for parsnip broth, they feasted behind stone walls on dishes so layered with spice and salt. Even the meat forgot its original taste. Roast swans stuffed with pork and herbs, lamb soaked in imported vinegar, custards laced with sugar, real sugar, not boiled down beet syrup. Their bread was soft, white, risen high with precious yeast. Yours was dark, flat, sometimes hard enough to crack a tooth. You remember one winter's night, trudging through mud past the manor gates. Through the slats you caught the smell of meat roasting over applewood. It hit your nostrils so hard it made you dizzy. You hadn't had meat in 3 weeks. Your dinner that night, onion boiled in weak ale, no bread, no salt. How could 2 stomachs live in such different worlds? Inside those high halls they didn't just eat, they performed. Courses rolled out like theatre. Pies that bled sweet syrup when cut, fish shaped like birds, loaves carved to look like lions. The food wasn't just nourishment, it was a symbol of dominance, of separation, of power. The more exotic the dish, the louder it shouted, "I am not one of you!" You, a peasant, a villain, a tenant, were never meant to touch those spices. Cinnamon, clove, ginger, nutmeg. They came from so far away, across oceans and deserts, brought by merchants who'd never set foot in a field. These flavours cost more than your year's rent. One dish at the Lord's table might contain ingredients from 5 different kingdoms, while you prayed your cabbage patch would survive the frost. Yet hunger made you curious. You'd ask the old ones what those feasts were like, those who once worked in the kitchens or polished silver for the head table. They'd whisper of dishes with names so strange they sounded like spells. They spoke of venison dripping with wine sauce, of pastries with almond milk and rosewater, of plates too fine to scrape clean. One woman, long retired, once wept as she recalled the leftovers she was forbidden to take home, meat thrown to the hounds while her brother starved. How many nights did you eat with your eyes, watching their carts roll by, smelling what you couldn't touch, listening to laughter echo across stone while your family shared silence over an empty bowl. But even they, those nobles, feared famine in their own way. Their greed for variety made them hoard. Their cooks were under pressure to deliver novelty. A lord might exile a chef for overcooking the goose. For you, that same bird would have been a godsend, feathers and all. You may not have sat at their table, but their excess was felt in your hunger. Every extra pound of wheat baked into their sweetened loaves was grain taken from the village store. Every suckling pig on their spit was one less in the common fields. Even during lean years their feasts continued, while mothers fed their children nettle porridge. Banquets in the castle overflowed, if not with food, then with illusion. They could afford illusion. You could not. And yet, you survived. Somehow, despite the gnawing emptiness, despite the mockery of golden tables out of reach, you made it to another season, not by indulgence, but by endurance, not by spice, but by soil. The divide was real. You felt it in your bones, your belly, your breath. Their feast was your famine, their fullness your ache, and still you endured. You don't just eat to live, you crave. Even now, even with an empty belly and a broken harvest, you still crave. Craving is the echo of memory. The roasted chestnut you once had, at 7 winters old, given to you by a wandering tinker. You've chased that sweetness ever since, or the pear you stole from the Lord's orchard during a drought, green, tart, so cold against your tongue it made your teeth ache. You got caught, but it was worth it, because in that moment you tasted more than fruit. You tasted rebellion. You tasted life. When you've grown up poor, with hunger always nearby, craving becomes a companion. It whispers to you in the quiet. It paints pictures behind your eyes, not just of food, but of fullness, of safety, of warmth. Your body remembers what your table forgets. And it's not just you. Everywhere you look, others carry their cravings like hidden wounds. The woman next door who sniffs wild mint like it's perfume. The boy who hoards acorns in his pockets, though they're bitter and barely edible. The old man who speaks of butter the way others speak of miracles. Craving teaches you to imagine. That's a dangerous power because when food is rare, dreaming of food is sacred. You begin to see it everywhere, in clouds, in bark, in the glint of river stones. Your senses sharpen. You know the weight of a carrot just by holding the stem. You can tell if barley is spoiled by the sound it makes in a sack. You can smell mould from 2 rooms away. Your hands know how to scrape, how to soak, how to stretch every flavour until it becomes something close to enough. But enough is a ghost in the manor. Enough is a platter not yet emptied. In your home, enough is a pot that's not yet burned. There is no shared language between the craving of the poor and the indulgence of the rich. When you crave, it is with your whole being. It's not about taste, it's about survival. The ache is in your teeth, your knees, your sleep. You dream of bread more often than love. You wake up chewing nothing. Even when food arrives, you eat it too fast, too hungrily, because part of you doesn't believe it's real, or that it will last. That's what lifelong hunger does. It makes joy suspicious. It turns even soup into strategy. Some say craving is gluttony, that you should be grateful for what little you have. But how can you explain to someone who's always been full what it means to want, not out of greed, but out of memory? Craving isn't shameful. It's ancestral. It's what drove your great-grandmother to boil leather shoes into soup. What made your uncle eat dandelions with mustard seeds to trick his stomach? What made you watch birds fly and wonder if you too could eat feathers? It's what keeps you alive. And in rare moments, when someone passes you a ripe plum or a bowl of stew you didn't expect, craving becomes a kind of joy, a silent celebration, a quiet miracle. You don't talk about it, but you feel it, that brief sense of being whole, of not needing, of tasting something all the way through. No fear, no rationing, just flavour, real and present. Those moments remind you that craving isn't a curse. It's a sign that your spirit hasn't given up, that your body still believes in more, that despite everything, famine, frost, fear, you still want, you still imagine, you still hope. because even if your bowl is empty, your soul still burns with the idea of enough, and that, in the end, is more powerful than any feast. The Viking Age wasn't a fantasy. It was a ferocious test of spirit, bone, and blood. Life offered no guarantees, only hard-won moments between storms, raids, and hunger. You wouldn't just need muscle to survive. You'd need instincts sharpened like blades, a stomach that could stomach anything, and a will that didn't crack when the fates screamed. To be a Viking was to live every day knowing it might be your last, and walking into that truth anyway. Most today wouldn't last a morning. Not because we're weaker, but because we've forgotten what it means to be constantly aware, constantly vulnerable, and still unyielding. They didn't have comfort, but they had courage, no safety, but endless skill. You might admire them from afar, but if you woke up in their world, barefoot in the snow with nothing but your breath and blade, you'd realize this wasn't a movie. It was survival, and it was brutal.